Section 1 Intro, and number 10, The Poochie Disaster. There is a show that has been running longer than most of the people watching this video have been alive. A show that premiered on a December night in 1989, slipped into the living rooms of a country that had never seen anything quite like it, and never left. 36 seasons. Nearly 800 episodes. More hours of television than most people will ever sit through in a single run. The longest animated series in American history. The longest-running sitcom, full stop. The longest-running scripted primetime show that has ever existed. And in all that time, the show has been brilliant, occasionally. It has been groundbreaking, frequently. It has been lazy, often. It has been controversial, more than most people remember. And it has handled those controversies with a range of grace that stretches from genuinely admirable all the way down to almost impressively terrible. That is what tonight is about, not the theories. Not the mysteries buried in the background of Springfield. Tonight, we are looking at the record. The actual, documented, canonical record of every major controversy the show created, stumbled into, deliberately provoked, or tried very hard to pretend never happened. And we are ranking them. Not by how controversial they were, not by how much noise they made on the internet or in the press or in the writer's room. We are ranking them by a single, very specific measure. How badly did the writers handle it? Because that is the real question. Every long-running show steps on a landmine eventually. Every creative team makes a call that looks worse in retrospect than it did in the moment. Every writer's room has that one story from that one season that nobody wants to bring up at the reunion. The measure of a show is not whether it creates controversy. The measure is what it does when the smoke clears. And The Simpsons, across 36 seasons and the better part of 4 decades, has done everything. It has handled things beautifully. It has handled things clumsily. It has handled things with such spectacular tone deafness that the results have become cautionary tales taught in television writing classes. And it has, on more than one occasion, handled things by simply refusing to handle them at all, by looking the other way and hoping the audience would forget, which is a strategy that works right up until the moment you build an entire franchise on the assumption that your audience never pays close attention. They pay close attention. They have been paying close attention for 36 years, and what they have found, what we have all found if we have been watching honestly, is a show that created some of the most memorable, most beloved, most culturally embedded television in history, and then, in its attempts to stay alive past the natural end of its run, slowly and methodically dismantled almost everything that made it great. That is the story we are telling tonight. We are going to start at number 10 and work our way up to number 1. And by the time we get there, we will have covered every major controversy, every mishandled creative decision, every baffling choice that the writers made and then had to live with, and every time the show looked directly at a problem it had created and decided that looking away was easier than fixing it. Get comfortable. Let the night settle around you. We are going to spend a long time in Springfield tonight. And what we find when we really look, when we stop accepting the cartoon logic and start asking the questions that the show always meant for us to ask, is a record that is equal parts brilliant and damning. A show that knew exactly what it was doing at its best and had no idea what it was doing at its worst. Starting at number 10. Number 10. The Poochie Disaster, or how the show invented its own criticism and then ignored it. In the summer of 1997, The Simpsons did something genuinely extraordinary. It looked directly at itself, at the machinery of network television that was already beginning to squeeze the creative life out of it, at the executive pressure that demanded more, louder, newer, flashier, and at its own temptation to comply with all of it, and it made an episode about exactly that. An episode that not only identified the problem but named it, anatomized it, dragged it out into the light of a primetime cartoon, and held it there for 22 minutes. The episode was called The Itchy and Scratchy and Poochie Show. It aired on the 9th of February, 1997, in the 8th season of the show's run, and it remains to this day one of the most self-aware, most surgically precise pieces of television criticism that any show has ever produced about itself. Here is what happens. The fictional cartoon within a cartoon, Itchy and Scratchy, the ultra-violent cat and mouse show that Bart and Lisa have been watching since the first season, is losing ratings. Children are going outside. The audience is drifting. The network executives who run Itchy and Scratchy are panicking because declining ratings mean declining revenue, and declining revenue means someone has to do something. So they do what network executives always do when they are afraid. They introduce a new character. The character is called Poochie. He is a dog. He rides a skateboard. He wears sunglasses. He has attitude. He says things like yo and raps and surfs and does every single thing that a network focus group in 1997 believed would resonate with young viewers who had been conditioned by years of marketing to respond to whatever brand of cool was currently being sold to them. He is, in every conceivable way, the result of market research rather than creative instinct. He is what you get when you replace storytelling with strategy. He is manufactured authenticity, bottled rebellion, corporate edge, and the show does not bother being subtle about any of this. Homer, naturally, gets the job of voicing Poochie. He prepares seriously. He brings genuine creative investment to the role. He believes in what he is doing. And the character is still terrible because the character was always going to be terrible, because the premise of the character was corrupt from the beginning. You cannot engineer spontaneity. You cannot manufacture the feeling that something is real when the entire architecture of its creation was designed to simulate realness rather than achieve it. When Poochie finally debuts on the fictional Itchy and Scratchy show, the reaction from children in the Springfield universe is exactly what the reaction from audiences in the real world would be to exactly this kind of character. Complete, immediate, total rejection. Children who had been glued to their television sets for the Itchy and Scratchy premiere walk away from the screen the moment Poochie appears. They go outside. They find better things to do. The ratings collapse not because children stopped wanting entertainment, but because the entertainment they were offered was an obvious, cynical substitute for the thing they actually wanted. And children are not as easy to fool as the people running focus groups would like to believe. The episode is devastating in its accuracy. The executives who created Poochie hold a notes session with the creative team where they explain, in the specific language of studio interference, what Poochie needs to be. They want him to be louder, more attitude. They want him to have his own catchphrases. They want him in every scene. They want him to address the audience directly, to break the fourth wall, to speak to the viewer at home as though they are personally in on the joke. They want him to be the most important character in every episode, pushing aside the characters that audiences actually love in favor of the shiny new thing that the marketing department invented to solve a ratings problem. And then, at the end of all of this, after a single disastrous episode, Poochie is killed, not gracefully, not with any narrative dignity. Homer records a heroic speech about how Poochie has decided to go home to his home planet because he is needed there, a speech that takes obvious creative investment and genuine emotional honesty, and the executives override it. They replace Homer's speech with the most perfunctory, dismissive exit possible. A caption on screen: Poochie died on the way back to his home planet. Done. Gone. The character who was supposed to save the show is removed from the show in the cheapest way imaginable, with a piece of text that does not even pretend to care. The children watching do not mourn. They are relieved. Now, here is the controversy. Here is the thing that transforms this episode from brilliant satire into something genuinely uncomfortable. Something that the show itself seems to recognize, but refuses to fully confront. The Simpsons wrote this episode in the 8th season. The 8th season. Which means that at the time this episode aired, the show was still in the late stages of its golden era, still producing work of real ambition and real craft, still operating from a place of genuine creative security. And the writers were already aware, clearly, demonstrably, right there on the screen, of the forces that would eventually compromise the show. They understood the mechanism. They understood how it worked. They understood that the pressure to add new characters, to goose declining ratings with shiny additions, to follow focus groups and executive notes rather than creative instinct, was a trap. They built an entire episode explaining exactly how that trap functioned. And then they fell into it anyway. Not immediately, not in the 8th season, but give it a few years. By the early 2000s, The Simpsons was adding recurring characters at a pace that would have horrified the writers who made the Poochie episode. The show that had explained, with extraordinary clarity, precisely why manufactured characters fail was now manufacturing characters. Characters who were louder, more attitude, more obviously engineered to be likable. Characters who pushed the existing cast to the margins to make room for themselves. Characters who arrived with their own catchphrases and their own predetermined audience reactions built into their first appearances. The show did not bring in one Poochie, it brought in several. Some of them were given regular spots. Some of them were promoted in marketing campaigns with exactly the kind of breathless enthusiasm that the episode had already diagnosed as the symptom of creative bankruptcy. Some of them are still in the show today, decades later, having outlasted any rational justification for their continued existence. The writers knew. They demonstrated that they knew. They put the knowledge on screen in beautiful, scalpel-sharp detail. And then they did the thing they knew was wrong. Not because they were hypocrites, necessarily, but because knowing that something is wrong and having the institutional power to refuse to do it are two very different things. The network wants what the network wants. Ratings pressure is real. The people who sign the checks have opinions, and those opinions have consequences. But that is precisely what makes this controversy so maddening. The show did not just stumble into a trap it could not see. It drew a map of the trap. It labeled the trap. It showed the trap in operation and demonstrated the predictable, inevitable outcome. And then, when the real version of the same trap appeared in front of the real writers, the map they had drawn was apparently not close enough to hand. There is another dimension to the Poochie controversy that gets less attention than the character introduction angle, and it is in some ways more troubling. Homer voices Poochie, and when the character fails, when the children reject him, and the ratings tank, and the executives decide to cut their losses, Homer is devastated. He gave something of himself to this role. He prepared. He tried. And his work was discarded not because it was bad, but because the premise it was in service of was always doomed, because the cynicism was baked into the foundation before any human creative effort was applied to it. There is an argument that this is the show dramatizing its own writer's experience. That Homer standing in front of the microphone, trying to bring genuine feeling to a character that the studio has engineered to be hollow, is an image of what it feels like to be a talented person working inside a system that does not ultimately care about talent. That the episode is not just about bad television. It is about the human cost of working inside an industry that routinely wastes the people it employs. If that reading is correct, and the evidence supports it rather strongly, then the episode is doing something even more sophisticated than self-critique. It is expressing grief. It is the show mourning, in advance, the fate of its own writers. The talented people who would be asked to voice Poochies for the rest of the series' run, who would be given mandates and notes and focus group directives, and would try their best, and would watch their work be overridden by decisions made in offices that had never understood what made the show great in the first place. That reading makes the episode almost unbearable in retrospect. The controversy here, ranked at number 10 on our list because it is the most distant from genuine harm and the closest to straightforward creative irony, is simply this. The Simpsons diagnosed its own disease in stunning detail and then caught it anyway. The writers handled this badly, not through malice or laziness, but through exactly the kind of institutional helplessness that the episode depicts. They were Homer at the microphone. They tried. The studio made the call. And the result was years of Poochie-level additions to a show that had already explained precisely why such additions were a mistake. The Poochie episode is often cited as one of the best episodes of the entire series. It won awards. It is studied in media programs. It is quoted constantly by people who have never even seen the full episode, but know the line about Poochie being needed on his home planet. And the show it comes from spent the next 2 decades being Poochie. That is the first entry on our list. That is where we begin. If you are finding a comfortable spot tonight, listening to this from wherever you happen to be in the world, go ahead and drop a comment right now. Tell me the time and tell me where you are watching from. I want to know where this is reaching. I want to know who is spending their evening in Springfield with us tonight. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Because we have 9 more entries to get through, and they only get more interesting from here. This is the gentle part of the list. It gets considerably less gentle. Subscribe and settle in. Section 2, Number 9. Armin Tamzarian and the episode that broke continuity on purpose. Number 9 on our list is the episode that has, for nearly 30 years, been cited by Simpsons fans as the single worst creative decision in the show's history. Not the worst episode in terms of jokes, not the least funny, not the one with the weakest plot or the most forced guest appearance or the laziest callback. The one that, in the judgment of a very significant portion of the show's most dedicated audience, represented a deliberate act of contempt toward the people watching. The episode is called The Principal and the Pauper. It aired on the 28th of September 1997, Season 9, Episode 2. And to understand why it is on this list, and why it sits at number 9 rather than higher, you need to understand both what the episode actually does and the argument that has been running about it ever since. Here is what happens in the episode, told as straightforwardly as possible. Springfield Elementary is celebrating the 20-year anniversary of Principal Seymour Skinner's tenure at the school. A party is organized, the community gathers, and then, in the middle of the celebration, a stranger walks in. The stranger is a man no one has ever seen before. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, not a Seymour Skinner, the Seymour Skinner, a Vietnam War veteran who was captured by enemy forces, held as a prisoner of war, and believed dead for the better part of 2 decades. He survived. He escaped. He made his way home. And he came home to discover that someone else had been living his life. The man Springfield has known as Seymour Skinner for 20 years is not Seymour Skinner. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before the war, Tamzarian was a street criminal, a petty offender with no family, no prospects, and no meaningful identity. He was drafted. He served in the same unit as the real Skinner. And when the real Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian felt guilt. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to Skinner's mother, Agnes. Agnes, overwhelmed by grief, assumed Tamzarian was her son. She needed him to be her son. And Tamzarian, who had never been needed by anyone, who had never had a name worth keeping, went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner and lived inside that identity for 20 years. This is a genuinely interesting premise, not inherently ridiculous, not inherently a betrayal of the character. Identity theft as a survival mechanism, a man who finds himself becoming someone else and eventually can no longer remember who he actually was, is rich, complicated narrative territory. The show has earned the right to go to complicated places. It has done it before. The episode where Homer meets his mother is devastating and quiet, and nothing about it is played for cheap laughs. The show can do this. The problem is not the premise. The problem is the resolution. The real Seymour Skinner, the actual man, the war hero who survived a prison camp and came home to find his identity stolen, is welcomed by the community. The truth is aired. Everyone knows. And then Springfield does something that the episode presents as the only reasonable outcome given the circumstances. It votes to pretend it never happened. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree. Armin Tamzarian is declared to be the real Seymour Skinner. The real Seymour Skinner, the man whose name, whose mother, whose entire life was taken from him, is tied to a railroad car and physically expelled from Springfield. And it is made explicitly illegal to ever refer to the real Skinner by name again under penalty of torture. The decree is handed down. The community accepts it. The episode ends with everything exactly as it was before the real Skinner arrived. Springfield has voted for the comfortable lie over the complicated truth, and the show presents this as a happy ending. Now, here is the argument that has been running for 27 years. On one side, this is a terrible episode that betrayed a beloved character, undermined years of careful continuity, and treated the audience with contempt by retroactively declaring that everything they knew about Principal Skinner was a lie. This side has significant support. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner, has publicly expressed his displeasure with the episode. Critics ranked it among the worst of the series almost immediately upon broadcast. The episode has a reputation, firmly established and stubbornly maintained, as the moment the writers stopped caring about the internal consistency of Springfield's world. On the other side, this is a brilliant, misunderstood episode that does exactly what the show is best at, which is using absurdist comedy to diagnose something real about the way communities function. The vote to maintain the lie, the legal decree making truth illegal, the physical expulsion of the truth teller from the community, these are not failures of craft. They are the point. They are the show telling you exactly how Springfield works, how any tight-knit community works, when reality threatens the comfortable narrative that holds it together. This side also has significant support. There are serious critics and longtime fans who argue that the Principal and the Pauper is unfairly maligned, that the very qualities that made people angry at it are the qualities that make it significant. that the episode is doing something darker and more honest about community psychology than the show is usually credited with? Both sides have real arguments. Here is where the controversy specifically earns its place on this list. The problem is not that the episode chose a dark resolution. The problem is not that it undermined Skinner's character, though it did, significantly, in ways that the show never fully acknowledged or addressed. The problem is that the writers apparently did not fully reckon with what they were doing when they wrote it. The evidence for this comes from the commentary tracks and interviews that followed the episode's broadcast. The writers were aware that they were taking a risk. They knew the premise was unusual, but the degree to which the episode would be received as a betrayal, the intensity of the audience reaction, appears to have surprised them. Which is interesting, because the episode was entirely correct about human psychology and entirely incorrect about how its own audience would respond to being told that something they had believed for 8 seasons was false. Here is the specific creative failure. The Principal and the Pauper works perfectly as an episode if it is set somewhere outside the existing continuity of the show. If Armin Tamzarian is a character we have never met before, living a stolen life in a town we are seeing for the first time, the story is interesting and the dark resolution is earned. The community's choice to maintain the lie reads as a sharp observation about how real communities function. But Seymour Skinner is not a character we are meeting for the first time. He is a character with 8 seasons of established history, 8 seasons of relationships, 8 seasons of specific quirks and specific backstory that the audience has absorbed and made part of their understanding of Springfield. The relationship between Skinner and Agnes, his history as a Vietnam veteran, his dynamic with Bart, his complicated feelings about his own career, all of this has been built up slowly and carefully over hundreds of episodes. It is not decoration. It is load-bearing structure. When the episode declares that all of it was based on a stolen identity, it does not just recontextualize Skinner's character, it retroactively removes the foundation from under 8 years of storytelling. Every scene between Skinner and Agnes is now a scene between a woman and the man who stole her son's identity. Every moment of apparent emotional authenticity is now something more complicated and less comfortable. The show essentially asked its audience to rebuild their understanding of a character they had come to know over nearly a decade, and it asked them to do this in service of a single episode's comic premise. That is the creative failure, not the dark ending, not the moral ambiguity, not the commentary on community psychology. The failure is the scope of the damage relative to the depth of the justification. The episode spent its resolution on a joke, specifically the joke of the legal decree and the physical expulsion of the truth, when the premise it had established deserved something more than a joke as its conclusion. And then, in the seasons that followed, the show handled the aftermath in the way the show always handles difficult aftermath. It pretended it had not happened. Skinner remained Skinner. The Armin Tamzarian reveal was mentioned occasionally, usually in a throwaway reference, but it was never integrated into the character in any meaningful way. The show did not explore what it meant for a man to have lived 20 years under a stolen identity. It did not examine what Skinner's relationship with Agnes looked like now that everyone knew. It did not ask whether a person who has lived as someone else for 20 years is still that person or not, which is a genuinely interesting philosophical question that the episode had placed directly in front of the writers. It just moved on, which is, in its own way, the most Simpsons possible response. The show introduced a premise that fundamentally altered a major character's history, provoked one of the most intense audience reactions in its history, and then filed it under things that had happened but would not be permitted to matter. The reason this is number 9 rather than number 1 is that the episode itself, whatever its creative miscalculations, is not without merit. The scene where Tamzarian explains his past to Marge, sitting in the Simpson kitchen in the middle of the night, quiet and unglamorous and honest, is one of the better dramatic scenes the show produced in that era. The performances are good. The premise, whatever its costs, is genuinely interesting. And the dark resolution, however clumsily it lands in the context of an established character, does reveal something true about how communities function. The writers handled this badly specifically in the aftermath, in their refusal to deal with what they had done. They created a premise that demanded follow-through and then declined to follow through. They opened a door that changed the room behind it and then painted over the door and told everyone the door had never existed. That is how Springfield handles uncomfortable truths. It turns out the show was better at depicting this pattern than it was at avoiding it. The reason people are still angry about this episode in 2025, 27 years after it aired, is worth sitting with for a moment. It is not that the episode was particularly offensive. It is not that it caused real-world harm. It is not even that it was the worst written episode the show had produced up to that point, because it was not. There are worse crafted episodes in the same season. The reason the anger persists is that the episode broke something that audiences had believed was safe, not just Skinner's continuity. The implicit contract between the show and its audience that said, "The things that happen in Springfield matter. The relationships have weight. The history is real, within the logic of the world the show has built. If something has been true for 8 seasons, it was true, and the show will honor that." The principal and the pauper said, "None of that is necessarily true. Everything you know about any character could be retroactively declared to have never been real, and the show will handle that declaration with a joke about a railroad car and a judge making torture legal. Once that contract is broken, it is very difficult to repair, and the writers, to their credit, apparently understood this eventually. The show did not return to the Tamzarian premise to make dramatic capital of it. It did not continue retroactively rewriting character histories in the same way. The episode remained a one-time incursion into territory that everyone involved seemed to agree, in retrospect, should have remained unexplored. But the damage was done. And it was done not because the premise was wrong, but because the execution lacked the courage of its own convictions. A show willing to go dark enough to declare the truth illegal should be willing to sit with the consequences of that darkness. The Simpsons, in its best years, always did. The Simpsons in Season 9 was already becoming a show that preferred the reset button to the reckoning. That preference is the real controversy. The Armin Tamzarian episode is its most visible symptom. Section 3, Number 8. APU and the Representation Controversy. Number 8 is different from everything else on this list in one fundamental way. Every other controversy we are discussing tonight is a controversy about craft, about whether the writers made good creative decisions or bad ones, about whether they had the courage of their convictions, about whether they handled the aftermath of their choices with care or cowardice. Number 8 is a controversy about something larger than craft. It is a controversy about who television is for, about whose humanity gets to be depicted with complexity and care, and whose humanity gets to be a shorthand, a joke, a convenient vessel for an accent, about what it means when the most visible South Asian character in the history of American primetime television is a convenience store owner with an exaggerated accent who exists primarily as a punchline. Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon has been a character on The Simpsons since the 3rd season. He runs the Quick E-Mart. He has an extremely thick accent drawn from a specific region of South Asia that is rendered in broad, theatrical terms. He is intelligent, he is educated, he has a doctorate in computer science, and he works at a convenience store anyway, which the show presents as mildly absurd and occasionally uses for specific satirical purposes. For a long time, Apu was simply part of Springfield's fabric, one of the recurring characters who gave the town its texture, its specificity, its sense of being a place populated by distinct individuals rather than anonymous extras. And then, in 2017, a comedian named Hari Kondabolu made a documentary called The Problem with Apu. The documentary made a straightforward argument. Apu, as a character, had been used for decades as essentially the only prominent South Asian representation in mainstream American entertainment. In a country with millions of people of South Asian descent, the most visible fictional South Asian was a character defined almost entirely by his accent and his job, a character performed by a white actor, a character who had been used as a template for mockery of South Asian people, specifically South Asian immigrants, throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. The documentary was careful and thoughtful. It did not argue that Apu was created with malicious intent. It did not argue that everyone involved in writing the character was a bigot. It made a more interesting and more uncomfortable argument, that even without malicious intent, even with genuine affection for the character, the representation had real consequences. That children of South Asian descent had grown up having Apu used against them in schoolyards, that the accent had become a standard tool for casual mockery, that the character had functioned as a stand-in for an entire demographic in ways that caused real, Documentable harm. The response from The Simpsons was swift. It was also, in the judgment of a significant portion of the audience and critics who covered it, one of the most spectacular mishandlings of a legitimate criticism in the history of television. The show's response came in a 2018 episode called No Good Read Goes Unpunished. In the episode, Marge discovers that a book she loved as a child has problematic elements and struggles with how to handle them. At the end of the scene, Lisa turns to the camera directly, breaking the fourth wall, and says, "Something that started decades ago and was applauded and inoffensive is now politically incorrect. What can you do?" And then Marge says, "Some things will be addressed at a later date." And then Lisa looks directly at a photograph of Apu on a shelf and shrugs. That was the response. Not a genuine reckoning. Not a creative reimagining of the character. Not even a real acknowledgement that the criticism had merit. A shrug. A, "what can you do?" A framing that casts the criticism itself as political correctness, as an external constraint being imposed on the show from outside, rather than a legitimate question about the consequences of creative choices. The response provoked immediate and intense criticism, not from people who had not seen the documentary, but from many of the same people who had engaged with it carefully and found its arguments worth taking seriously. Hari Kondabolu himself responded, noting that the episode seemed to suggest that the solution to a character who reinforced harmful stereotypes was to do nothing, while implying that the people raising the issue were the problem. Let's hold the specific question of whether Apu's portrayal was harmful to one side for a moment, because the answer to that question, while important, is not actually what earns this controversy. Its place at number 8 on this list. What earns it number 8 is the specific way the writers chose to respond to the criticism. When faced with a sincere, documented, carefully argued case that one of their characters had been used to harm real people, the meaning side had a range of options available to them. They could have engaged with the argument seriously and found ways to develop the character that addressed the valid concerns while preserving what was genuinely good about Apu. They could have written him out of the show gracefully, acknowledging that the character as constructed had limitations they could not responsibly address. They could have recasted the role and changed the performance to something less reliant on broad vocal caricature. They could have done any number of things that would have demonstrated that the show took its responsibilities toward the people it depicted seriously. They wrote a scene where Lisa shrugs at a photograph. The creative choice to frame the criticism as political correctness being imposed from outside, rather than as a legitimate internal question about the show's own practices, revealed something important about how the writers understood their relationship to their audience. Or rather, which part of their audience they considered when making decisions. And then, in 2020, Hank Azaria, who had voiced Apu since the beginning, announced that he would no longer be performing the character. The statement was significant not just for the decision itself, but for the reasoning behind it. Azaria had spent time in the years following the documentary talking to people of South Asian descent about their experiences with the character. He had listened. He had reached his own conclusion that continuing to perform the accent was not something he could do responsibly, and he stepped away from the role. Apu has since largely disappeared from the show. He appears occasionally in crowd scenes. He has no significant storylines. The character who was a fixture of Springfield for nearly 30 years has been quietly set aside, not dramatically retired, not given a meaningful send-off, not reimagined by a South Asian performer who might bring something different and more grounded to the role. Just quietly reduced until he was not really there anymore, which is, in its own way, a response. But it is a response that raises its own questions about how the show values its characters when those characters become complicated to deal with. Here is what is genuinely interesting about this controversy when you look at the full arc of it. The Simpsons in its early seasons was genuinely innovative in its depiction of ethnic and immigrant characters. The show took its setting seriously as a place where different kinds of Americans lived next to each other, and it tried, within the limits of its satirical mode, to render those characters as people rather than props. Apu, in many episodes, was written with more dimension than the shrug response in 2018 acknowledged. He has friends. He has a marriage. He has a complex relationship with his homeland and his adopted country that the show occasionally examined with real care. The critique was not that Apu was only ever a caricature. The critique was that the character's existence as the dominant representation of South Asian people in American primetime The fact that for many viewers he was the primary reference point for what a South Asian person sounded like and acted like put a burden on the character that the show had never been designed to carry. That when you are the only one, the full weight of an entire group's representation falls on you, and that weight is rarely comfortable. The show's response did not engage with this argument. It engaged with a simpler version of the argument that was easier to dismiss. That is a creative failure of a specific kind, not the failure to be perfect, the failure to listen carefully enough to understand what was actually being said. And the aftermath, the quiet erasure of Apu rather than a genuine creative reckoning with what to do about him, is arguably more damaging to the character than anything the critics of his portrayal ever said, because it treats Apu as a problem to be managed rather than a character to be considered. It treats him as a liability rather than a person. And if the criticism was that the show had not fully treated Apu as a person, solving that problem by making him disappear is not exactly a counter-argument. Number 8 on the list. Not at the top because the show did, eventually, make a significant change, even if that change was made without the courage to say clearly why. And not lower because the shrug in the Lisa scene was a genuinely remarkable thing to broadcast in response to a genuinely sincere and documented argument. Section 4. Number 7. Frank Grimes and the death they refuse to reckon with. Number 7 is different from every other entry on this list in a very specific way. It is not the controversy of an episode. It is the controversy of a single character and what the show did to him, and specifically what the show refused to do with what his existence meant. The character is Frank Grimes, and the episode is Homer's Enemy, which aired on the 4th of May 1997 in the 8th season. It is one of the most discussed episodes in the show's history, and one of the most debated in terms of what it actually says, and whether the show understood what it was saying. Here is what happens. Frank Grimes is a new employee at the Springfield nuclear power plant. He is a man who has, through extraordinary effort and personal suffering, earned everything he has. His backstory is established in the episode with unusual care. He was abandoned at the age of 4. He worked his entire life. He educated himself. He suffered accidents and setbacks and financial hardship and came through all of them through sheer determination. He has a degree in nuclear physics. He earned it through night school while working multiple jobs. He is by any reasonable measure a person who deserves respect and success. He is placed in an office across from Homer Simpson. The rest of the episode is Frank Grimes watching Homer exist in a world that, from any rational perspective, should not be kind to Homer. Homer is lazy. Homer is irresponsible. Homer regularly makes catastrophic mistakes that should end his career and have not. Homer has a beautiful house, a loving family, a boat, and a job that he should by any rational measure have been fired from 1,000 times. Frank Grimes looks at Homer Simpson's life and has the reaction that anyone paying attention would have. He is furious. Not petulantly, not selfishly. His fury is the fury of a person who has followed the rules, done the work, paid the costs, and discovered that the person next to him who has done none of those things has received all the same rewards. The episode positions Grimes as the real-world intrusion into Springfield's cartoon logic. He is what happens when someone who operates by the actual rules of consequence and cause and effect arrives in a world where those rules do not apply. At the end of the episode, Grimes has a breakdown. His frustration with Homer's existence, with the fundamental unfairness of a world that rewards Homer's obliviousness while demanding effort and suffering from everyone who plays by the rules, drives him to a final act of protest. He mimics Homer's behavior. He acts like Homer. He ignores safety warnings. He grabs live electrical cables. He is killed. And at his funeral, Homer falls asleep and talks in his sleep and everyone laughs. That is how Frank Grimes is commemorated. The man who represented the intrusion of real-world consequence into Springfield's insulated logic is buried while the town laughs at the person whose existence drove him to his death. Now, here is the controversy. The episode is extraordinary television. Genuinely. It is one of the sharpest, most structurally ambitious things the show ever did. The decision to introduce a character who operates by different rules precisely to use that character as a lens through which to examine what is actually happening in Springfield, what Homer's existence actually means, is a bold, intelligent, creative choice. But the show never came back to it. Frank Grimes died and Springfield forgot him. which is what Springfield does with everything that makes it uncomfortable. But Frank Grimes was not just a character. He was a structural argument. His existence was the show asking itself a question. What does Homer Simpson mean? What does the world that enables Homer's consequence-free existence say about that world? The episode raised that question and then answered it, briefly and darkly, with his death. And then the show moved on. Frank Grimes Jr. appears in a later episode as the son seeking revenge for his father's death. He is treated as a comic villain, his father's legacy reduced to a motive for a revenge plot, the revenge itself diffused and played for laughs. The weight of what Frank Grimes Sr. represented, the weight of that funeral scene, of Homer sleeping and the crowd laughing, while a man who had done everything right was lowered into the ground, was converted into a premise for a lighter episode and discarded. The controversy at number 7 is not that the show killed Frank Grimes. The death is justified, dramatically. It is the logical endpoint of what the episode was doing. The controversy is that the show killed Frank Grimes and never processed what that killing meant. Here is what it meant. Homer Simpson's world is, within the logic of the show's universe, one in which consequences do not apply to certain people and apply mercilessly to others. Homer survives everything. He is forgiven everything. He is rewarded despite having done nothing to deserve reward. And Frank Grimes, who represents the principle that effort should be rewarded and failure should have costs, is destroyed by the encounter with that world. He is destroyed not by Homer specifically, but by the cognitive dissonance of realizing that the world does not work the way he was told it did, that the rules he followed were not the rules that actually governed outcomes. That is a dark observation about something larger than a cartoon. That is an observation about meritocracy, about the gap between how societies say they function and how they actually function, about the human cost of believing the official story about how the world works when the actual world operates by different principles. The show was capable of making that observation. It did make it. Homer's enemy is evidence that it made it, but making an observation and being willing to live with the implications of that observation are different things. The show lived with the implications of Homer's enemy for exactly as long as the episode ran, and then chose to live with something else instead. The choice to introduce Frank Grimes Jr. as a comedy character was not inherently wrong, but it was a choice that said, the question Homer's enemy raised will be answered with a joke. The anger of a man who played by the rules and died for it will be converted into a comic premise and discharged through laughter. That is not how you honor what Homer's enemy actually was. And here is the specific way the writers handled this badly. The episode works, in part, because it presents a version of Homer that is genuinely difficult to sympathize with. Homer is not the lovable buffoon in this episode. He is genuinely oblivious to the damage he causes. He is genuinely happy, while a man who has tried harder and deserved more is systematically destroyed by the encounter with his existence. The episode asks the audience to sit with that, to really sit with it, and to recognize that their affection for Homer is not uncomplicated, that the world that enables Homer's happiness is not a neutral thing. That is hard work for an audience to do, and the show asked them to do it, and then immediately reassured them that it was okay to keep loving Homer anyway, that the darkness was contained to the single episode, that Frank Grimes was a one-time experiment rather than a permanent shift in how the show understood its main character. The reassurance was probably necessary for the show to continue running, but it was also a choice to step back from the edge of something genuine that the episode had reached. It was a choice to diffuse the charge rather than let it keep building. Number 7, because the episode itself is one of the best things the show ever did. The handling of the aftermath is what earns it a place on this list. Section 5, Number 6, the Flanderization of every character who was not named Homer. Number 6 is not about a single episode. It is not about a single controversy with a clear beginning and a clear end. It is about a process. A slow, grinding, decade-long process that changed almost every major character in the show, and that the show's most dedicated fans have been documenting and mourning with extraordinary precision since approximately the early 2000s. The process even has a name. It is called Flanderization. The term comes from Ned Flanders, the Simpson family's neighbor, who in the early seasons of the show was a fully realized character. He was religious, yes. He was cheerful, yes. His faith was genuine and his goodness was genuine, and the show treated both with complexity and care. But he was also a character who had dimensions beyond his religion. He had anxieties. He had a past. He had a specific kind of loneliness that the show examined in detail in several of its best episodes. He was, within the logic of Springfield, a complete person. And then, over the course of several seasons in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Ned Flanders became his most obvious trait. His religion was no longer one dimension of a complex person. It became his entire personality. Every episode featuring Ned became an episode about Ned being religious. His other dimensions were reduced to supporting roles that existed primarily to give the religious dimension a platform. His anxiety was funneled into religious anxiety. His loneliness was funneled into religious loneliness. His history and his relationships were subordinated to the running joke that Ned was very, very Christian. The character became a caricature of his own most recognizable quality. And then the same thing happened to almost everyone else. Principal Skinner, who in the early seasons was a complicated figure, a former prisoner of war with genuine authority and genuine anxiety, and a relationship with his mother that balanced comedy and pathos with real skill, became the episode where his authority is undermined and he runs to his mother, over and over. The complexity compressed down to a single dynamic, repeated until the character was essentially a single note played in different contexts. Chief Clancy Wiggum, who began as a genuinely corrupt and lazy police officer in a satirical tradition that went back to long before The Simpsons, became an almost purely comedic figure whose incompetence was no longer rooted in the systemic critique that made it interesting and was instead just a reliable generator of stupid cop jokes. Professor Frink became exclusively his speech pattern. Comic Book Guy became exclusively his condescension. Sideshow Bob became exclusively his attempts to kill Bart. Patty and Selma became exclusively their disdain for Homer. Nelson Muntz became exclusively his laugh. One by one, the residents of Springfield shed the layers that had made them interesting and were reduced to their most immediately recognizable quality. The one thing about them that audiences could identify in a single frame, the trait that could serve as a shorthand in a scene that needed a quick supporting beat without the effort of actual character development. This process did not happen overnight, and it did not happen uniformly. Some characters retained more complexity than others. Lisa Simpson, arguably, was largely protected from the worst of it, though even she was occasionally reduced to a mouthpiece for whatever social issue the episode was addressing, rather than a person with her own interior life. Marge suffered a different, but related fate, becoming increasingly defined by her worry and her long-suffering patience in a way that flattened what had once been a genuinely rich character. Homer is the most interesting case because Homer's Flanderization went in a different direction. In the early seasons, Homer was not primarily stupid. He was limited. He was working class. He was not educated. He made poor choices for specific, characterizable reasons. He was mean sometimes and generous other times. He was capable of surprising insight and routine failure. He was, within the cartoon's logic, a recognizable human being. And then Homer became dumb. Not limited, not working class, not occasionally wrong, catastrophically, almost supernaturally stupid. A character for whom intelligence was not just absent, but impossibly absent, in ways that broke the internal logic of even a cartoon universe. Homer began making choices that no person, regardless of intelligence level, would actually make because the choices existed to generate specific comedic outcomes rather than to reflect anything true about the character. The shift was gradual and the show resisted acknowledging it, but it is there in the record and it is precisely dateable if you watch carefully enough. There is a Homer of Season 3 and there is a Homer of Season 12, and they are not the same person. The later Homer is louder, more violent in a slapstick register, more cartoonishly oblivious, less capable of the specific kind of emotional truth that made early Homer episodes devastating in ways that animated television had rarely achieved. The controversy at number 6 is about the process itself, and specifically about how the writers handled the accumulated damage, and the answer is, they handled it largely by not handling it. There was no moment when the show looked at what had happened to its characters and decided to rebuild what it had lost. There was no season-long arc of restoration. There was no creative reckoning with the question of why complex characters had become simple ones and what that simplification meant for the show's ability to do what it had always done best. The writers occasionally seemed to notice what had happened. Episodes that appeared to be attempts at recapturing the original complexity of specific characters would surface every few seasons. A Ned Flanders episode that tried to re-engage with his genuine darkness. A Homer episode that tried to reconnect with his emotional truth. A Lisa episode that tried to give her a real interior life again rather than a cause to champion. These episodes were often good. Occasionally, they were among the best things the show was producing in the years when it was producing them, but they existed as isolated events rather than as the beginning of a sustained shift in how the show understood and handled its characters. And the reason they were isolated rather than sustained is the reason Flanderization happened in the first place. It is much harder to write a complex character than to write a simplified one. A character defined by a single trait can be deployed in a scene with minimal setup. A character with multiple dimensions requires the writer to hold all of those dimensions in mind simultaneously and make choices about which ones are active in a given moment. In a show producing 22 episodes a season, in a writer's room under constant deadline pressure, the temptation to reach for the shorthand rather than the full portrait is enormous and almost irresistible. Flanderization is not the result of writers who stopped caring. It is the result of writers under institutional pressure choosing the path of least resistance over and over again, until the path of least resistance became the only path they knew how to walk. That is a real creative tragedy. And the failure to address it, the failure to say, this is what has happened to our characters and here is what we are going to do about it, is a genuine creative failure in the precise sense that it represents a choice not to act on a problem that the people involved almost certainly could see. The aftermath is still being managed today. The simplified versions of most of these characters are the versions still on screen. Springfield's residents are still, 30 years after the process began, largely trapped in the amber of their most immediately recognizable quality, waiting for a creative decision that would allow them to be full people again. That decision has not come. Number 6. Section 6. Number 5. The spin-off showcase and the creative graveyard of ideas that never became shows. Number 5 is a specific episode that exists at the intersection of two different controversies, and understanding it requires understanding both. The episode is called The Simpsons Spin-off Showcase, which aired on the 11th of May, 1997, in the 8th season. On the surface, it is a metafictional experiment. The conceit is that network executives, unsatisfied with the core Simpsons show, have demanded 3 potential spin-offs featuring characters from Springfield. The episode presents 3 such spin-offs as mock pilots, each one a broad parody of a specific type of television programming. The first is a Chief Wiggum detective show set in New Orleans. The second is a wacky sitcom about Homer becoming a bachelor after Marge leaves him. The third is a variety show hosted by Krusty the Clown that includes a musical number and various guest appearances. All 3 are deliberately terrible. That is the joke. They are bad in ways that are recognizable to anyone who has watched a lot of American television, bad in the specific ways that calculated, executive-driven television tends to be bad, and the episode invites the audience to laugh at the badness with a kind of knowing sophistication. The episode is clever and it is funny, and it is operating in the same satirical mode as the Poochie episode, taking aim at the machinery of network television from inside the machine. But here is the controversy. At the time the episode aired, The Simpsons was already generating significant executive pressure to actually produce spin-offs. The show was a cultural and commercial phenomenon of a kind that television had rarely seen, and the network understood that the Springfield universe contained enough characters and enough world-building to potentially support additional programming. The question of whether to spin off, and what to spin off, and how to do it without diluting what made the original show valuable, was a real ongoing conversation happening in real rooms. The episode was, among other things, a response to that conversation. The show's writers, or at least some of them, were using the episode to make an argument about what spin-offs tend to look like when they are generated by executive pressure rather than genuine creative vision. The argument was, they tend to look like this: recognizable genre formulas with Springfield characters poured into them, familiar television shapes given a thin coating of Springfield-flavored paint, not new ideas, appropriated containers. That is a legitimate argument. The history of television spin-offs supports it vigorously. But the episode's comedy and its criticism were somewhat complicated by what actually followed it. Because The Simpsons did eventually generate a spin-off. Futurama, created by Matt Groening, premiered in 1999. It was not technically a Simpsons spin-off in the narrative sense. It was a new show set in a different universe with different characters, but it came from the same creative mind, and it demonstrated what was possible when genuine creative vision, rather than executive mandate, drove the expansion of a franchise. It was original. It was weird. It took risks that spin-offs generated by network committees cannot take, because network committees are constituted to minimize risk. It became one of the most beloved animated shows of its era, and arguably exceeded The Simpsons in creative ambition during the years when both shows were running simultaneously. Futurama is evidence for the argument the spin-off episode was making. You can expand a creative universe. You can generate something new and valuable from the foundation an original show builds. But you have to do it with genuine vision, not with the formula-fitting exercise that the episode depicted. The controversy is not, in this case, about the episode itself. The episode is mostly good. The controversy is about the gap between what the episode argued and what the network apparatus surrounding the show actually produced over the years that followed. The years after the spin-off episode saw The Simpsons license itself aggressively, not necessarily into other shows, though there were conversations about various proposals, but into merchandise, into theme park experiences, into a feature film, into the kind of franchise expansion that generates revenue in proportion to the willingness of the creative owners to commodify the property. The Simpsons movie arrived in 2007, 18 years into the show's run. It was a significant cultural event. It performed well commercially. It was received with a kind of warmth from audiences who had missed the earlier seasons and were happy to see the family on the big screen, and a kind of critical guardedness from people who had been watching the show closely enough to notice that it was operating at a creative level considerably below what the best years of the show had achieved. The film is fine. It is a feature-length episode of The Simpsons at approximately the level of quality that The Simpsons was producing at the time, which is to say it is competent, frequently funny in isolated moments, emotionally engaged in ways the show had become intermittently capable of, and not particularly ambitious. It does not take the risks that a Simpsons movie, with the security of its release platform and the freedom from episodic television constraints, could theoretically have taken. It is, essentially, a spin-off showcase segment made with a larger budget. The controversy earns its place at number 5, not because any single decision was catastrophically mishandled, but because the accumulated pattern of franchise decisions over the show's second and third decades reveals a consistent preference for the safe and the calculable over the risky and the genuinely creative. A show that built its identity on being willing to go somewhere unexpected chose repeatedly, when given the freedom and the resources to really go somewhere unexpected, to go somewhere recognizable instead. The spin-off episode diagnosed this tendency. The years that followed confirmed the diagnosis, and the writers handled it badly in the specific sense that they had already articulated, with great clarity and considerable wit, exactly what the wrong path looked like and then walked down it anyway. There is something almost poignant about this. The show was, at its best, a machine for producing that specific kind of humor, where the joke is also the truth. The Poochie episode is funny and accurate. The spin-off episode is funny and accurate. The self-awareness was real. The diagnosis was correct. But the show ran for decades after the diagnosis without finding the treatment. And the people who made it, or at least many of them, knew what the treatment would require. It would require saying no. It would require the creative team having enough authority over the direction of the franchise to decline the opportunities that would generate revenue but dilute the thing that made revenue possible in the first place. That kind of authority is extremely rare in network television. The absence of it is the real story behind number 5. Section 7, number 4. Who Shot Mr. Burns and the Contest Nobody Won. Number 4 is the greatest mystery in the history of the show, and the most fascinating controversy on this list, because it is the only one where the mishandling was so complete and so well documented that it effectively became part of the show's mythology rather than just a footnote to it. We are talking about the summer of 1995. We are talking about a network television stunt that had never been attempted by an animated show before and has never been replicated in quite the same way since. We are talking about the specific, documented, still unresolved question of whether the show solved its own mystery in a way that made honest, narrative sense, or whether the answer it gave was the cheapest available solution to a puzzle that the writers had constructed without a clear answer already in mind. Let us go back to the beginning. Season 6, Episode 25. Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 1. The date is the 21st of May 1995, and The Simpsons pulls off something genuinely unprecedented. Mr. Burns has gone too far. This is not unusual for Mr. Burns. Going too far is essentially his recreational activity. But in this particular episode, Burns escalates to a level that the show had been building toward for years without committing to the payoff. He steals an oil well discovered beneath Springfield Elementary, eliminating the school's budget. He bankrupts Moe's Tavern. He creates a sinkhole that destroys the Springfield retirement castle. He injures Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog. And for his conclusion, his final gesture of comprehensive villainy, he builds a giant mechanical sunblocker and uses it to deprive Springfield of sunlight, ensuring that every resident must purchase electricity from his plant because no solar alternative will function. Every person in Springfield has a motive. The episode takes careful time establishing this. Homer, because Burns persistently forgets his name despite years of employment. Bart and Lisa, because the school lost its funding. Grandpa Simpson, because the retirement home was destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, because he lost his job. The musician Tito Puente, because the music program was cut. Moe, because his bar went under. Smithers, freshly fired by Burns himself for objecting to the sunblocker scheme. Then, at a town meeting where tensions reach their breaking point, with multiple characters visibly armed, Burns collapses. A single gunshot wound. He staggers to the town's sundial. His hands land on two letters, W and S, or from his own perspective, M and S. The ambulance comes. The screen goes black. America is left to wonder. Fox promoted this as a national event. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special treating the shooting as if it were a real, unsolved crime. The show ran a contest, extensively publicized, inviting viewers to submit their guesses for the shooter. The winner would be animated into a future episode. Then Part 2 aired in September. The investigation plays out. Smithers confesses but proves he was elsewhere. Alibis fall apart and accumulate. An eyelash belonging to a Simpson is found on Burns's suit. Homer's fingerprints are on the gun. Homer is arrested and nearly convicted. And then Burns wakes up and identifies his shooter. It was Maggie, baby Maggie Simpson, who encountered Burns in the parking lot, struggled with him over a lollipop, picked up his fallen gun, and fired. Chief Wiggum notes that no jury in the world would convict a baby. Everyone goes home. Episode ends with Maggie alone in a room, checking to make sure no one is watching, and then mimicking pulling a trigger with her pacifier. The case is closed. Except the contest nobody won is the thing that will not stay buried. The show's writers acknowledged on the DVD commentary tracks that when they randomly sampled entries to the national contest, essentially no one had correctly guessed Maggie as the shooter. One person, posting on a Simpsons news group online on the night of the original broadcast, had apparently gotten it right. By the time the contest concluded and the production team tried to locate this person, the college internet account was no longer active. The person was never found. An open invitation was extended on the DVD release for them to come forward. As far as anyone has been able to determine, they never did. This means that the show invited a national audience to solve a mystery it described as solvable from the clues in Part 1, offered a significant prize to the winner, ran the contest, and when the answer was revealed, essentially no one had guessed correctly. Either the mystery was not as solvable as advertised, the red herrings were so effective that they overwhelmed the genuine clues, or the answer did not follow logically from the evidence the way the show claimed it did. Here is the specific case that the answer did not follow logically. Start with Burns's last words before being shot. "Oh, it's you." He said these words with recognition, but without alarm. Not, "Who are you?" Not a startled exclamation. A calm, even mildly weary acknowledgement of someone he recognized and did not consider a threat. The question, does Mr. Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? Has he ever interacted with her in a meaningful way that would prompt this kind of familiarity? The show does not establish such a relationship prior to the shooting. Burns barely recognizes Homer, and Homer has worked for him for years. The idea that Burns would respond to the sight of an infant with the kind of resigned familiarity of, "Oh, it's you," does not fit the pattern of how he has been established to respond to people he barely knows. The gun. Burns carried it in a holster. Prior to the shooting, the holster is shown empty. Someone had already taken the gun before the attack occurred. This means the shooting was not spontaneous, it was performed with a weapon that had been taken from Burns earlier, and it means the shooter was someone who had access to Burns in the period between when the gun disappeared and when the shooting occurred. The sundial. Burns's hands fell on the letters W and S, which the show interprets as M and S, from Burns's own upside-down perspective, standing for Maggie Simpson. Burns himself stated within the episode that the positioning of his hands on the sundial was not intentional. He did not deliberately position himself to point to his attacker's initials. He fell. The central physical clue of the mystery was explicitly described by the victim as coincidental. The DVD commentary includes the writers acknowledging that alternate endings were fully produced, not just written or storyboarded, fully animated and voiced. The alternate ending with Smithers as the shooter was complete enough to be screened in The Simpsons' 138th episode Spectacular Clip Show, where Troy McClure dismisses it by noting that all the Simpson DNA evidence would have to be ignored. An early draft featured Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers considered multiple shooters seriously enough to develop them to the point of full production before landing on Maggie. What this suggests is that the shooter was not predetermined by the clues. The clues were adjusted to accommodate whichever answer the writers eventually chose. The mystery was constructed in reverse, beginning with the premise and working backward to justify it, rather than being constructed from the inside out with an answer embedded in the structure from the beginning. This is not inherently a crime. This is how a lot of mystery storytelling works. But it creates a specific problem when the mystery is promoted as solvable by a paying audience. If the answer was not embedded in the structure, if the clues were adjusted after the fact, then the contest was not a genuine invitation to solve a genuine puzzle. It was a marketing exercise that borrowed the language of a genuine puzzle while lacking the architecture. The show handled this badly in two specific ways. First, the promotion. The show sold the mystery as solvable and promoted a national contest around that claim. When the answer came and no one had solved it, the honest response would have been to acknowledge that the mystery was harder to crack than advertised, or that the answer was chosen for reasons other than its logical inevitability. Instead, the show doubled down on Maggie as the answer and filed the contest. Nobody won under things that happened, but would not be further discussed. Second, the answer itself. Maggie as the shooter is a functional choice within the show's universe. A baby cannot be prosecuted. The choice creates a kind of poetic logic in which the most powerful man in Springfield is brought low by the most defenseless person in the town. There is thematic elegance to it, but the show never seriously committed to the implications of that answer. If Maggie Simpson is the person who shot Mr. Burns, what does that mean? Is she the most dangerous person in Springfield? Is her silence in subsequent seasons a strategic choice made by an infant who understands the value of maintaining her cover? The show has occasionally gestured at this reading, but never genuinely committed to developing it. The answer exists primarily to close the case, not to open a new understanding of the character. And in Season 18, Homer casually mentions in a throwaway line that he was actually the one who shot Burns. Nobody investigates, nobody reopens the case. The mention sits there in the record, unaddressed, a piece of canonical dialogue that either means nothing, which suggests the show is being careless with its own mythology, or means something very specific about the reliability of the Maggie answer, which the show has never been willing to say out loud. That unaddressed ambiguity is the controversy, not the mystery itself. The handling of the mystery's resolution and the show's subsequent unwillingness to take its own answer seriously enough to build on it. Number 4. Section 8, Number 3. Homer's character assassination and the decade it took to get there. Number 3 is the one that hurts most if you have been watching long enough. Not because it involves a single terrible decision, not because there is a moment you can point to and say, this is where it happened, right here, this specific scene, this specific episode. Number 3 is a slow burn. It is a gradual, cumulative, decade-long process that resulted in the character at the center of the show's entire moral universe being replaced by a version of himself that shares his name and his appearance and almost nothing else. We are talking about what happened to Homer Simpson between approximately season 8 and season 12. In the first 7 or 8 seasons of the show, Homer Simpson is something quite specific and quite remarkable for a primetime animated character. He is not smart, but his limitations are specific and rooted in character rather than in the requirements of the joke. He is impulsive. He is emotionally reactive. He has the kind of gaps in knowledge and foresight that come from a specific background, from a specific kind of working-class upbringing that never gave him the tools to think carefully about long-term consequences. He is selfish in ways that are recognizable and occasionally shameful, but also in ways that the show treats with honesty, acknowledging that the selfishness comes from somewhere, from anxiety and need and the particular kind of emotional malnourishment that the show connects, carefully and over many episodes, to the absence of his mother. And he is capable of love in a way that is absolutely central to everything the show does. The episodes that remain the most beloved in the show's history, the ones that critics return to when they want to argue that The Simpsons at its best was one of the finest things American television produced, are almost universally episodes that depend on Homer's capacity for love being genuine and being tested. Lisa on Ice, in which the Simpson family's competitive dynamics collide with the siblings' genuine bond, works because Homer's love for both his children is real, and his failure to express it properly is real, and the gap between those two things generates actual feeling, rather than just comedy. Bart Sells His Soul works, partly because of what Homer's obliviousness costs him in terms of his relationship with his children, and what the show reveals about the cost, without making it comfortable to watch. Homer's relationship with Marge, across the best episodes of the early seasons, is a portrait of a marriage that is simultaneously ridiculous and genuine, held together not by perfection but by the specific, difficult, sometimes heroic work of two people choosing each other over and over, even when the choosing is hard. This is not what Homer becomes. By approximately season 9, the character begins to shift. The shift is incremental, and the show's defenders will argue, with some justice, that individual episodes during this period are still very good. And they are right. The golden age does not switch off at a specific date like a light. It fades. But what fades, specifically, is Homer's emotional truthfulness. The later Homer does not just make bad choices. He makes bad choices in ways that are decoupled from any recognizable human motivation. He is cruel in ways that early Homer was not cruel. Not because the show is exploring a dark side of the character, but because the cruelty is the engine of the joke and no examination of where it comes from or what it means is required. He is stupid in ways that have no connection to a recognizable human experience of being limited or uninformed, but instead exist purely as mechanical generators of comedic outcomes. He survives things, increasingly, because the show needs him to survive them. And the survival is played for spectacle rather than for the mixture of absurdism and emotional consequence that made early Homer's indestructibility feel like something more than a cartoon convention. The cruelty is the most troubling shift. Early Homer is sometimes mean. He is occasionally terrible to his children. He is frequently selfish in ways that have real costs. But the meanness is either a failure of self-awareness, meaning Homer does not understand what he is doing and the show does, or it is the show being honest about the ways in which ordinary people can be ordinary monsters in ordinary domestic situations. The meanness is embedded in a character you can still recognize as human. The later Homer is mean in ways that feel calculated. Jokes are constructed around his meanness in a way that requires the meanness to be a stable character trait rather than an occasional failure. He becomes, in some episodes, a person it is genuinely difficult to root for, not because the show is doing something interesting with the moral complexity of its main character, but because the comedy requires him to behave badly, and the show has decided that examination of why is optional. The specific controversy at number 3 is not just that this happened. It is that the show knew it was happening, addressed it directly in specific episodes, and then kept doing it anyway. The episode where Homer has the crayon removed from his brain and his intelligence returns is relevant here. When Smart Homer exists briefly, the character is immediately recognizable as the Homer of the first several seasons. He is observant. He is emotionally present. He makes connections. He has the kind of sensitivity to the world around him that the earlier Homer had and the later Homer had largely lost. The episode is, among other things, a eulogy for what Homer had been. And then he has the crayon put back in. The show's explanation for this is that being smart in Springfield is unbearable. That Homer chooses the fog because the fog is kinder than clarity. That the stupidity is not imposed but chosen. That it is the product of a man who looked at what his life really was and decided that not understanding it was preferable to living with that understanding. This is a genuinely dark and genuinely interesting reading of Homer's character. It has real thematic depth. It suggests that what looks like stupidity is actually a survival mechanism, a chosen anesthesia against a reality too painful to inhabit with full cognitive engagement. But the show does not develop this reading. It uses it for the episode and then files it away. The Homer of subsequent seasons is not a man who has chosen not to see. He is a man constructed to be funny in ways that require him to not see, and the distinction matters enormously. The chosen stupidity reading treats Homer with dignity. The constructed stupidity of the later seasons does not. The controversy earns its place at number 3 because Homer Simpson is the show. Not just the most prominent character, but the moral and emotional anchor of everything the show does. When Homer is written with honesty and depth, the show achieves things that animated television had never achieved before. When Homer is written as a vehicle for comedic outcomes, the show is technically functional but emotionally hollow in a way that cannot be disguised by good jokes. And the writers, or at least some of them, understood this. The episodes that revisit early Homer's emotional register, that try to reconnect with what the character was before the simplification took hold, are evidence that the knowledge of what had been lost was still present somewhere in the room. The knowledge that Homer at his best was not just funny but genuinely moving, that his love for his family was the gravitational center of the show's universe, that losing access to that love was not just a creative choice but a kind of creative abandonment. The aftermath of this controversy is the ongoing Simpsons of today. Homer is still the main character. He is still on screen more than any other character. He still generates the most material and the most plot. But the Homer on screen now, in the show's 36th season, is a character with a different relationship to the emotional truth of the original than any adaptation or continuation of a character should probably be comfortable with. He is recognizable. He is not the same. And the writers handled it badly by handling the loss of the character gradually enough that no single decision ever announced itself as the catastrophic mistake it collectively turned out to be. The damage accumulated slowly. By the time it was undeniable, the character had been in his simplified form for long enough that rebuilding him would have required a kind of sustained creative commitment that the show's institutional structure was no longer set up to support. Number 3. Section 9. Number 2. The controversial episodes they quietly buried. Number 2 is the category of controversy that the show itself has been least willing to discuss openly. Not because these controversies are the most harmful of everything on our list. Not because they represent the worst creative decisions or the most spectacular mishandlings. They are at number 2 because of a specific quality they share, a quality that reveals something important about the show's institutional relationship to its own history. These are the controversies that The Simpsons has attempted to make disappear, not from the cultural record, because the cultural record does not cooperate with disappearances in the internet age, but from the practical, accessible version of the show, from the streaming libraries, from the syndication packages, from the version of the show that a new viewer in 2025 would encounter if they went looking for Springfield for the first time. The show has, over the past several years, pulled multiple episodes from streaming platforms. Not all the controversial episodes. Not even necessarily the most controversial ones, in the strict sense of the word. A specific selection of episodes that share a common thread. They contain content involving characters of specific ethnic backgrounds performed in ways that their communities found degrading, or they contain gags that time has made impossible to defend, or they contain specific bits of cultural shorthand that the show was willing to use in 1994, but is not willing to stand behind in 2020. The most prominent of these removals involved episodes featuring characters in brownface or blackface, Scenes where white actors performed caricatured versions of non-white characters in ways that went beyond the already complicated question of Apu's portrayal and into territory that the show's producers, on reflection, decided they could not continue to make available as though nothing had changed. The removal of these episodes is a creative and ethical decision that needs to be examined carefully and with some complexity, because there are real and competing values at stake. On one side, there is a genuine argument that broadcasting or streaming content that is harmful to specific communities is not an obligation that any entertainment company has, and that removing such content is a responsible exercise of editorial judgment. Art does not exist in a vacuum. A scene that was unremarked upon in 1995 may have a different weight and different consequences in 2020, not because it has changed, but because the context around it has changed. Because the accumulated history of what that kind of content has done is now part of what any viewer brings to the screen when they encounter it. On the other side, there is a real and uncomfortable argument about what it means for a cultural archive to be selectively edited. The Simpsons is not just entertainment, it is a document. 36 seasons of episodes constitute a record of what American popular culture thought and said and laughed at across nearly 4 decades. Removing episodes from that record does not change what the show said, or what it meant, or what effects it had. It changes the accessibility of the record. It changes what a future scholar or student or casual viewer can easily find. It makes the history of the show's missteps harder to access while leaving the show's achievements intact. This asymmetry is not nothing. An institution that makes its successes readily available and its failures difficult to access is not engaging in honest accounting. It is managing its reputation rather than examining its record. The controversy at number 2 is specifically about how the show handled the removals, rather than about whether some episodes should have been removed. Because how the show handled them was, characteristically, with a minimum of direct engagement and a maximum of institutional PR. There was no careful, public, honest accounting of what was in the pulled episodes and why it was considered harmful, and what the show's creators understood now that they had not understood when the episodes were made. There was no engagement with the specific question of what it meant for the show's legacy that content it had produced was now considered unsuitable for general audiences. There was no statement from the principal creators that engaged seriously with the years of criticism that had preceded the removal decision, or acknowledged the people who had been raising these concerns long before the removal happened. There was a quiet removal and a brief statement noting that the episodes had been taken down. The pattern is consistent with how the show handles all its most uncomfortable controversies. Look away. Wait for the noise to diminish. Make the minimum possible change that allows the noise to diminish. File the whole thing under things that happened but will not be further discussed. This is the second most characteristic institutional behavior the show has displayed, the most characteristic being the one we will discuss at number 1, and it is the behavior that earns number 2, its place above everything else we have covered tonight. Because the Poochie problem is a tragedy of self-awareness. The Armin Tamzarian problem is a tragedy of creative overreach. The Apu problem is a tragedy of selective listening. The Frank Grimes problem is a tragedy of courage. The Flanderization problem is a tragedy of institutional pressure. The spin-off problem is a tragedy of creative authority. The Burns mystery is a tragedy of promotional overcommitment. The Homer problem is a tragedy of gradual erosion. The episode removal problem is a tragedy of honesty. The show that spent 36 years diagnosing American culture's relationship to uncomfortable truths, that built some of its best episodes around the observation that communities will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid confronting their own history, that made the mechanism of collective denial legible in episode after episode, that gave us Springfield's vote to criminalize the truth and exile the truth-teller, handled its own discomfort exactly the way Springfield handles discomfort. It made the inconvenient things less accessible and hoped that would be sufficient. But there is another set of episodes in this category that have not been removed but perhaps should have been examined more honestly, and these are the episodes where the show itself was not ignorant of its own missteps but was instead fully aware of them and chose to go ahead anyway. These are harder to categorize and harder to be fully confident about because the record is not always clear. But there is a pattern visible in certain episodes, particularly in the later seasons, where the show's willingness to engage with charged material appears to be motivated less by genuine creative ambition and more by the desire to provoke attention. There is a category of episode that functions primarily as a controversy delivery mechanism. The episode's goal is to be talked about, not to say something. The controversy is not a byproduct of genuine creative risk-taking, but the product itself. The episode exists to generate the conversation about whether the episode should exist. This kind of content is not unique to The Simpsons. It is a pattern across late-period, long-running shows when creative ambition has declined, but the need for cultural relevance persists. The show can no longer generate attention through quality alone, so it generates attention through provocation. The provocation may not be in service of any particular artistic purpose beyond the attention itself. The show handled this pattern badly in the specific sense that it does not appear to have distinguished clearly between provocation in service of something and provocation as an end in itself. Both produce controversy. Only one produces something worth the controversy. And the people who tried to make the distinction, who tried to ask, what is this episode for? What does it mean? What does the provocation produce beyond the provocation? Were often told that they were being oversensitive, or that the show had always pushed boundaries and this was simply more of the same. It was not always more of the same. The difference between the show pushing a boundary because the story demands it and pushing a boundary because the marketing department needs a headline is visible if you look closely enough. The difference is in the craft. A genuine creative risk has craft underneath it. A controversy delivery episode has the controversy on top and not much underneath. The show produced both across its history. Distinguishing between them honestly requires more self-examination than the show's institutional structure has ever supported. That is the controversy at number 2. Not a single episode, not a single decision. A pattern of behavior that reveals something about how the show understands its own relationship to the communities it affects and the history it is creating. A pattern of looking away when the mirror becomes uncomfortable. A pattern of making the minimum possible change while deploying the language of genuine reckoning. A pattern that is, when you look at it clearly, the most Springfield behavior imaginable. The town that voted to make truth illegal is the show that quietly pulled the evidence of its own discomfort from the streaming libraries, while declining to explain, with any real honesty, what had taken it so long to recognize the problem was there. Let us stay with this for a moment longer, because it deserves more than a summary. The specific episodes removed from streaming include several that contained characters played in ways that are now recognized as racially caricatured. The removal happened in 2020, in the specific cultural context of a moment when these questions were receiving unprecedented public attention. The timing is meaningful. It is meaningful not because the timing was wrong. The timing was arguably right in the sense that these conversations needed to be happening at a cultural scale, and the removal of content that embeds harmful caricature into major entertainment platforms was a reasonable response to those conversations. It is meaningful because of what the timing reveals about how institutional decisions get made. These episodes did not change between 1994 and 2020. The communities affected by their content did not change. The specific criticism of this kind of caricature had been available, had been articulated by the people affected by it, had been published and discussed and documented for decades before the removal happened. What changed in 2020 was the cost-benefit calculation for the institution. Before a certain point, the cost of removing the episodes, in terms of audience reaction, in terms of the conversation that removal would generate, in terms of the self-examination that removal would implicitly require, exceeded the perceived cost of leaving them in place. After that point, the calculus flipped. The cost of leaving them in place exceeded the cost of removing them. The decision was made. That is how institutions work. This is not a revelation. This is how almost every institutional decision about potentially harmful content works. The question is not whether an institution eventually makes the responsible choice. The question is what it reveals about the institution that the responsible choice required a specific threshold of external pressure to become available. The Simpsons, as a creative enterprise, has always been at its best when it was ahead of the external pressure rather than behind it. The earliest seasons were genuinely ahead of their moment. They were saying things about American culture, about the working class, about the relationship between institutional power and ordinary people, that were not being said at that volume anywhere else in primetime television. The show was not following cultural consensus. It was producing cultural commentary that was several steps ahead of where the broader conversation was. The late period show is, characteristically, behind the external pressure. It responds to criticism by making the minimum change required to reduce the criticism to a manageable level. It does not initiate. It does not lead. It does not get ahead of the problem and say, from a position of genuine creative engagement, here is what we did wrong and here is what we are going to do differently. That is the distance between the show at its best and the show as it is now. And the people watching, the people who have been watching for 30 years, can feel that distance even if they cannot always articulate exactly what has been lost. What has been lost is the sense that the show is genuinely thinking, that somewhere in the room, someone is asking the real question. Not the question that the marketing department wants answered, not the question that generates the most comfortable outcome for the institution, but the actual question about what the show is doing and what it means and whether it is worth doing. That sense of genuine thought is what made the early show feel important. Its absence is what makes the late period show feel, despite its competence and its occasional genuine moments of inspiration, like something that has outlasted its reason for being. Number 2. Section 10. Number 1. The show refusing to end and what it cost everything. Number 1 is not about a single episode. It is not about a single character, or a single creative decision, or a single season that went badly. It is not even about a single controversy in the way that the entries below it are controversies. Number 1 is about the decision to keep going, and specifically about how that decision, extended year after year after year, long past any creative or artistic justification, has functioned as the engine that made every other controversy on this list not just possible but inevitable. The Simpsons should probably have ended somewhere around 1997 or 1998. This is not a fringe opinion. This is not the revisionist judgment of critics who watched the decline from a distance. This is an opinion that has been expressed in various forms and at various levels of directness by people who were actually in the room, who were actually writing the show, who were there for both the peak and the decline and who understand the difference between the two because they experienced both firsthand. The show's creative peak, the run of episodes that built its reputation and established its legacy, corresponds roughly with the period from the 3rd season through approximately the 8th. These are the seasons that critics return to. These are the episodes that appear on greatest of all-time lists. These are the episodes that people who loved the show unconditionally quote from memory, sometimes with chapter and verse accuracy, sometimes 30 years after first seeing them. They are good in a specific way that is connected to something the show had during that period and lost afterward. They are good because the people making them still had something to prove. The early Simpsons was a show that was fighting for its existence in a culture that did not know what to do with it. It was an animated primetime sitcom, a form that American television had largely abandoned since the Flintstones, and it was made by people who understood that they were doing something new and who brought to that newness the specific kind of creative energy that comes from not yet being fully secure in what you are. They were trying things. Not all of the things worked, but the trying was genuine, and the willingness to fail in interesting ways is what distinguishes a show that is reaching for something from a show that is managing its existing assets. By the late 1990s, the show was the dominant cultural force in American primetime television. It had won awards. It had changed the landscape of what animated content could be on television. It had made careers. It had generated revenue on a scale that the network had never anticipated when it greenlit a spin-off from a sketch comedy show that had been running between other people's content on Fox's late-night programming. It was, in the precise sense of the term, too big to fail. And too big to fail is a very dangerous thing for a creative enterprise to become. Because too big to fail means that the institutional pressure to continue, to keep the machine running, to protect the revenue stream and the employment of hundreds of people, and the licensing deals and the merchandise and the theme park arrangements and the international distribution becomes so overwhelming that the question of whether the creative enterprise still has something worth saying becomes secondary. The machine keeps running because the machine keeps running. The show kept going past season 8, past season 10, past season 15, past season 20, past season 25, into season 30, into the current, ongoing, 36th season. And somewhere in all of that continuation, somewhere in the years between when the show was fighting to prove itself and when the show was a legacy property being managed by the institution it had built, something that had once been urgent became comfortable. And comfortable is death for comedy. The specific controversy at number 1 is not that the show continued. Long-running shows have continued past their creative peaks before and will continue to do so. The controversy is about how the show's continuation has handled what continuity costs, about whether the people responsible for the show have been honest with themselves and with their audience about the trade-offs involved in keeping a franchise running when the creative engine that powered it has been running on reserve, fuel for the better part of 2 decades. The honest answer is that they have not been fully honest. The institutional response to the show's decline has followed a consistent pattern. When critics argue that the show is not what it was, the response has been defensive rather than engaged. When audience numbers tell a story about a show that has lost much of the viewer base that defined it, the response is to reframe what the numbers mean rather than to ask what they indicate. When individual episodes or seasons receive negative attention from longtime fans, the response is to acknowledge isolated failures while declining to acknowledge the systemic pattern that the isolated failures are evidence of. This is how institutions behave when they are protecting themselves rather than interrogating themselves. And it has consequences that extend beyond the specific question of one television show's creative decline. Here is the real cost of what The Simpsons' refusal to end has done. It has changed what the show means. Not just what the show is now, what the show was, retroactively. The continuation of a creative work beyond a certain point does not just add new material to the existing body. It recontextualizes the existing body. It changes how the earlier material is understood because the earlier material now exists in relationship to 36 years of continuation rather than 8 years of peak achievement. When someone who has never seen The Simpsons sits down with the show in 2025, they do not watch the first 8 seasons and then stop, experiencing the show as the peak achievement it was. They encounter something that has been running for 36 years, something that has accreted 3 decades of diminishing returns around the core of what made it valuable, something that the general cultural understanding of includes not just the Golden Age but the long, slow management of the Golden Age's legacy. The show's reputation is not just its best work. It is its best work plus 36 years of everything that followed. And the weight of the everything that followed has changed how the best work is seen, not for people who know the show well enough to make the distinction, but for the broader cultural understanding of what the show is and what it represents. This is not a trivial cost. The specific things that the show sacrificed to keep running need to be named directly, because naming them is the only way to understand the full weight of what number 1 means. It sacrificed the creative arc. Stories have shapes. Even episodic television, even shows that do not have a predefined ending, have shapes. The shape is not just individual episode arcs or seasonal narrative threads. It is the shape of what the show is over time, the way the characters develop and change and deepen, the way the world of the show becomes more richly understood the longer you spend in it. This shape requires an ending, or at least the possibility of an ending, to be coherent. The knowledge that something can end is part of what gives the things within it weight. The Simpsons is now a show in which the characters explicitly cannot develop because development would threaten the franchise. The show has been running long enough that this impossibility has become visible in a way it was not when the show was younger. The children will not grow up. The parents will not grow old. The relationships will not resolve. The stories will not end. The thing that was once a cartoon convention, the floating timeline, the permanent present tense of animated sitcoms, has become, in the context of 36 years, a prison. Homer cannot grow, because growth would imply that the Homer of Season 1 was incomplete. And if the Homer of Season 1 was incomplete, then you need an ending to complete him. And the ending is the thing the institution cannot afford. So he stays incomplete for 36 years, for hundreds of episodes. Through how many moments that could have been resolution but were instead reset, it sacrificed the character's dignity. There is a specific kind of indignity that comes from being used past your usefulness, not necessarily treated badly in any specific instance, just kept running when the reasons for running have become institutional rather than creative. Characters who were once genuinely interesting having to generate stories for their 42nd or 63rd or 98th episode, not because there is something important about who they are that the audience has not yet seen, but because the schedule requires an episode and the character is available. Most of the major characters of Springfield are now famous for being characters in The Simpsons, rather than for being the specific, irreplaceable, one-of-a-kind people that the early seasons suggested they were. The specificity has been worn smooth by repetition. The edges have been rounded. The characters work because they are recognizable, not because they are surprising. And a character who is only recognizable is a character who has been reduced to a brand. It sacrificed the show's cultural authority. The Simpsons, at its best, had genuine cultural authority. It said things about America that needed to be said, and it said them in a way that made them impossible to ignore because the saying was so brilliantly, unexpectedly well-crafted that even people who disagreed could not dismiss it. The show's cultural authority was not given to it. It was earned, episode by episode, in the period when the show was genuinely thinking rather than managing. That authority is substantially diminished now. Not because the show is incapable of producing good work, it still is, occasionally, and the good work that it produces in its best, late-period episodes is genuinely good. But the authority of the institution to say something important about American culture is not the same as it was in 1994. The authority was built on the assumption that when the show said something, it was saying something that had been arrived at through genuine creative engagement, through the specific effort of talented people wrestling with real ideas. When the assumption is no longer confidently available, because the institution has been managing its legacy rather than extending its genuine thinking for decades, the authority is compromised. The show can still make jokes about American culture. It cannot make arguments about American culture with the same force it once had. The trust that made those arguments land has been partially spent. And the show has handled all of this, specifically handled the question of when it should end and what continuing costs, in the way it handles every uncomfortable question. It does not engage with it directly. There have been no genuine, public, honest conversations from the people running the show about what the show's continuation costs. There have been no creative choices that suggest a willingness to sacrifice institutional longevity for creative integrity. There have been no moments when the show looked at itself honestly and said, "We are past the point where continuing serves the thing we built, and we should find a way to end that honors what this was, rather than continuing in ways that gradually diminish it." There have been announcement after announcement of renewal. Season after season picked up, contracts extended, the machine kept running. This is, in the end, a business decision. It is a decision that the people with the authority to make it have every right to make. The show is their property. The continuation is within their power. None of what has happened is a violation of any rule, but it is a violation of something. It is a violation of the implicit compact between a creative work and the audience that loves it. The compact that says, "We made this because we had something to say, and we will keep making it only as long as we still have something worth saying, and when the saying is done, we will find an ending that honors the thing we built, rather than managing its legacy until the last possible revenue opportunity has been extracted from it." The Simpsons, at its peak, believed in that compact. The evidence is in the work. The care that went into the best episodes, the willingness to take creative risks that could have damaged the show's popularity but were taken anyway because the creative ambition demanded them, the specific quality of attention that characterizes the best work, all of this is the evidence of a creative enterprise that was operating from genuine conviction. The continuation, the 36-season continuation, is the evidence of an institution that has prioritized its own survival over its own integrity. And the writers handled it badly, most of them, by going along with it, by writing the next episode, when the next episode was commissioned. By not collectively and publicly raising the questions that the show's own content had been raising about exactly this kind of institutional self-perpetuation for 30 years. The Simpsons has episodes about how institutions that should end don't end because they are too expensive to shut down. The show diagnosed this dynamic with characteristic precision. Burns refuses to bring the plant up to code not because he lacks the resources, but because acknowledging the problems would mean acknowledging the damage they have already caused, and acknowledging that is more expensive than continuing to pretend everything is fine. The show that ran for 9 more seasons than it probably should have, that gradually converted its most beloved characters from people into franchises and its most ambitious creative instincts into brand management, was not unable to see what it was doing. It had already written the episode explaining exactly this dynamic. It had just decided, as Springfield always decides, that the comfortable continuation was preferable to the honest ending. And that is the #1 controversy on our list. Not the biggest single decision, not the most dramatic mishandling, just the slow, quiet, institutional choice to be Poochie rather than retire Poochie. To keep the lights on past the point when the light was serving anything. To give Springfield one more season, and one more, and one more, and one more, because ending would mean admitting that the thing had always been temporary, that the family could not stay on the couch forever, that 36 years had passed in the real world, even if they had not passed in Springfield. To do what Homer did when he chose the crayon, to choose the fog over the clarity, to choose the comfortable unreality over the painful truth, to go home to Evergreen Terrace one more time. Because ending means admitting it was always going to end, and Springfield, as the show has spent 36 years explaining with extraordinary care and considerable dark humor, does not do endings. It does resets, and the reset is always more comfortable, until it isn't. Section 11 Extended Analysis. What these controversies have in common and why it matters. We have been through 10 entries on this list. We have covered 36 years of creative decisions, missteps, recoveries, failures of nerve, failures of honesty, failures of craft, and failures of institutional courage. We have spent time with every major controversy the show has generated or stumbled into or been unable to escape. And now it is worth asking what all of these controversies share, because they do share something. Not in every specific, not in the surface details of what the controversies were about, but in the deeper structure of how each one arrived and how each one was handled. The common thread is this. Every controversy on this list, without exception, was visible before it became a controversy. Every mishandling that earned its place in our ranking was a mishandling that could have been seen coming by anyone paying close enough attention to the signals the show's own content was generating. The Poochie problem was visible in the Poochie episode itself, which announced what the wrong path looked like before the show had fully committed to walking down it. The Armin Tamzarian problem was visible in the ambition of the premise, which was always more interesting than the execution could support, given the existing weight of the character's established history. The Apu problem was visible in the gap between the complexity the character occasionally achieved and the caricature he was primarily used for across the broadest reach of the show's cultural impact. The Frank Grimes problem was visible in the courage of the episode, which pointed clearly toward questions the show was not ready to answer and then created the augmentation that it might. The Flanderization problem was visible in the early season's own complexity, which established a standard that the later seasons were transparently failing to meet. The spin-off problem was visible in the episode that diagnosed it. The Burns mystery problem was visible in the promotional promises that the show made about the solvability of its own puzzle. The Homer problem was visible in the distance between the character's early emotional authenticity and the purely mechanical construction he gradually became. The episode removal problem was visible in years of documented criticism from affected communities that the show declined to engage with until the cost of non-engagement exceeded the cost of engagement. And the #1 problem, the staying too long problem, was visible in 36 years of the show's own most insightful content, which repeatedly and precisely identified the dynamics of institutional self-preservation at the expense of institutional integrity. Every single one. Visible in advance, mishandled anyway. This is not an argument that the people making the show were careless or stupid or indifferent to quality. The evidence strongly suggests the opposite. The people who made the show's best work were extraordinarily careful and intelligent, and deeply invested in the quality of what they were producing. And the people who oversaw the show's continuation through its more difficult decades were not, for the most part, people who had stopped caring. The argument is about something more structural than individual carelessness. The argument is about what happens to creative enterprises when they succeed beyond a certain threshold. Before that threshold, the pressures on the creative enterprise are largely productive ones. The pressure to be better than you were last week. The pressure to justify your existence in a competitive landscape. The pressure of an audience that has not yet decided whether to trust you, whose trust has to be earned fresh each time. These pressures sharpen things. They create the conditions in which great work is more likely to be produced because the alternative to great work is irrelevance rather than revenue management. After that threshold, the pressures change. The audience trust is now a given rather than something to be earned. The competitive landscape has been navigated successfully enough that the show occupies a secure position in the culture. The pressure to justify existence has been replaced by the pressure to maintain existence, which is a fundamentally different orientation. Maintaining is a defensive posture. It is about not losing what has been gained rather than about reaching for what has not yet been achieved. And in that defensive posture, the instinct that generated the best work, the instinct to take the risk, to say the thing that might not land, to go somewhere unexpected, even at the cost of making some people uncomfortable, is replaced by the instinct to protect. The show went from saying things because it needed to say them, to managing its reputation for having said them. And every controversy on this list is a consequence of that transition. Because controversies are, at their root, the result of a gap between what an audience expects and what it receives. When a show's audience trusts it enough to follow it somewhere unexpected, the gap between expectation and experience is productive. It generates conversations, debates, genuine engagement with the ideas the show is exploring. When a show's audience has learned that the gap between expectation and experience is more likely to be a failure of craft or a failure of courage than a genuine creative adventure, the controversies become something different. They become disappointments. They become evidence. They become the accumulating record of a show that knows better and does not do better, and the knowing but not doing is the specific thing that provokes the kind of sustained anger and sustained grief that attaches to Simpsons controversies in a way that the controversies of lesser shows do not generate. Lesser shows are forgiven their failures because no one expects much of them. The Simpsons is not forgiven because it was great enough to be held to a higher standard. That is the paradox of being one of the best things television has ever produced. You create the audience that will be most devastated by your decline. There is a specific version of this conversation that has been happening online and in criticism for close to 20 years now. The conversation about when The Simpsons went bad, not just whether it went bad, that is largely settled territory at this point, but the precise moment. Season 9, Season 10, Season 11. The Armin Tamzarian episode, a specific bad joke in an otherwise good episode, a specific episode that crossed a line that had not been crossed before. People will argue about the precise moment with an intensity that is itself interesting, because the argument about the precise moment is not really about the precise moment. It is about something more personal. It is about the specific episode that each person was watching when the trust they had in the show first broke, when the gap between what they expected and what they received was large enough to register as damage rather than as productive surprise. For different people, that moment is at different places in the timeline, which is why the conversation never fully resolves. Everyone brings their own version of the break to the table. Everyone's heartbreak happened at a slightly different time. And because the show's decline was gradual rather than sudden, because there was no single catastrophic episode that everyone agrees on as the moment it went wrong, the argument about the precise moment keeps running, fed by the fact that everyone who loved the show early enough to experience the decline has their own specific personal memory of when it happened. This is part of the genius of what the early show built. It built an audience that cared enough to notice when the caring was no longer being reciprocated, an audience that had been trained by the show's best work to expect the best from the show, and that experienced the show's failures as something closer to personal betrayal than simple disappointment. That is not a small thing. A show that can make people feel something that specific, something that personal, about a cartoon family in a fictional American town, is a show that did something that almost nothing else in the history of television has done. It made Springfield feel real. Not real the way a documentary is real. Real the way a place you love is real. The way a neighborhood you grew up in is real. The way the people whose lives have intersected with yours are real. With weight and history and specific texture that makes them impossible to simply forget or replace. The controversies on this list hurt because Springfield was real. The mishandlings are injuries not to a piece of entertainment but to a place that a significant portion of the global audience has lived in, has returned to, has understood as a kind of compressed, heightened, satirically amplified version of the world they actually inhabit. When the show handles its own controversies badly, it is not just making a creative misstep. It is doing something to that place. Something that changes what it is and what it means to be there. And because the show has never fully reckoned with the cost of that, because the institutional response has consistently been to protect rather than to examine, the changes accumulate without being acknowledged, and Springfield slowly becomes something different from what it was. Not worse in every way, not without anything worth having, but different, less itself, more managed, more like the version of itself that the town council voted into existence in The Principal and the Pauper, the comfortable fiction that everyone agreed to maintain because the alternative was too difficult. Before we close, I want to say something about why this list exists and what I hope you take from it. This is not a eulogy for The Simpsons. The show is still going. It still produces work that is, in isolated moments, genuinely excellent. The people working on it now are talented people doing their best within constraints that are institutional rather than personal. The characters are still recognizable as characters. Springfield is still a place. This is also not an argument that you should stop watching, or stop caring, or allow the late period show's limitations to diminish your affection for what the early show achieved. The early show is there. It exists. It is available. The first 8 seasons are some of the finest work American television produced in the 20th century, and no amount of decline changes that. What this list is, what this ranking is an honest accounting. An honest accounting of what the show's record looks like when you examine it with the same critical attention that the show always brought to everything it examined. When you apply to the show's own decisions the same analytical rigor that the show applied to American culture in its best years. And what that honest accounting reveals is a show that was capable of extraordinary self-awareness and was not always able to act on that self-awareness when it would have required institutional sacrifice to do so. A show that diagnosed its own disease precisely and did not take the medicine. A show that told you, over and over and in brilliant detail, exactly what was wrong with a world where institutions prioritized their own survival over their own integrity, where the comfortable lie was preferred over the uncomfortable truth, where the people with the power to change things chose not to because the cost of changing things exceeded the cost of continuing as they were. And a show that, in its relationship to its own history and its own controversies, behaved exactly like the institutions it spent 36 years satirizing. That is not a condemnation. It is just the record. The Simpsons is the most important show in the history of American animated television. It is one of the most important shows in the history of American television. Full stop. It changed the landscape. It changed what was possible. It said things that needed to be said, and it said them in ways that could not be ignored. And it also made every mistake on this list. Both things are true. Both things have always been true about great things that outlast their greatness. Both things will continue to be true about The Simpsons for as long as it runs, and probably for a long time after. Section 12. The full extended deep dive. Specific episodes, specific moments, and the full record. We have covered the 10 major controversies in ranked order. We have traced the common thread. We have made the case for why each entry earned its place. Now let us go deeper. Because the record of The Simpsons is not just its major controversies. It is the texture of thousands of decisions made over 36 years, and some of the most interesting material is in the details. In the specific episodes that sit at the edge of the major controversies but did not make the top 10. In the smaller mishandlings that accumulate into the larger pattern. In the moments where the show got things exactly right, and the moments where it got them exactly wrong, sometimes in the same episode. Let us start with the material that almost made the list. The Marge and the Monorail episode exists at an interesting intersection. The episode is almost universally considered one of the greatest in the show's history. The Conan O'Brien penned script is brilliant. The satire of civic boosterism, of the specific way communities can be convinced to spend money on vanity projects rather than genuine infrastructure, is sharp and lasting and has, like many of the show's best observations, only become more relevant with time. But there is a controversy buried in the episode that gets less attention than its well-deserved reputation as a classic. The episode was written, in part, as a commentary on the way the show's creative staff had been treated by the network. The monorail salesman, the charismatic, silver-tongued figure who sells Springfield something it does not need and does not understand, is widely understood as a critique of certain kinds of television industry behavior of the people who sell networks on ideas with more enthusiasm than substance, and then leave before the consequences arrive. This reading is supported by enough circumstantial evidence that it has become more or less accepted. And if it is correct, the episode is doing something that the show was doing consistently in its best years, using the fictional world of Springfield as a space to process real experiences and real grievances from the people making the show, transmuting industry frustration into universal satire. The controversy, small but real, is that the show was not always transparent about when it was doing this. When personal grievances were being channeled into what appeared to be pure satire, the audience was not always in a position to know what was actually happening. This is not necessarily wrong. The audience's ignorance does not diminish the satire, but it means that the apparent universality of some of the show's most celebrated observations was, in at least some cases, something more particular and more personal. This is not a damning criticism. It is a complicating one. The show's authority to speak about American culture was, in part, the authority of people with specific inside knowledge about one specific industry's worst habits, channeled through a fictional Midwestern town in ways that made it look more universal than it was. The satire was real, but the specific knowledge driving it was sometimes more particular than it appeared. Let us talk about the Conan O'Brien period in more detail. Conan O'Brien was a writer on The Simpsons in the early 1990s, and his tenure coincides with some of the show's most celebrated episodes. He left to host Late Night, and the show continued. The Conan period is frequently cited as evidence of the writing staff's extraordinary quality during the Golden Age, and the episodes from that period are genuinely excellent. But there is a question that does not get asked enough about the Conan period, and the period that surrounded it. What was the writer's room actually like during the years when the show was at its best? The answer, based on various accounts that have emerged over the years, is that it was a place of genuine creative intensity and all by most accounts, a place with significant problems in terms of how people were treated, in terms of the specific dynamics of who had power and who did not, in terms of the working conditions that produced brilliant television at considerable human cost. This is not unique to The Simpsons. This is a pattern across the history of American television, particularly in comedy writers' rooms, where the culture of creative intensity and the culture of institutional protection for talented people are frequently in tension. But it is worth naming because it connects to something in the show's own content. The Simpsons, across its history, has produced some of television's most insightful commentary on the relationship between institutional power and the people who work within institutions. The show understands with extraordinary clarity how workplaces can extract value from people while offering them inadequate protection. It understands the specific dynamics of environments where the brilliant work of talented individuals is owned by institutional structures that benefit from the brilliance without necessarily protecting the brilliant. It understands this because, by multiple accounts, the people making the show had experienced it. The controversy here is not about any specific incident. It is about the gap between the show's content and the show's practice. A show that diagnosed power structures with such precision and produced that diagnosis under working conditions that were, at various points, documented as difficult in specific ways that the diagnosis had named. This does not make the work less good. The work is still the work, but it adds a dimension to the question of who the show was for and who it was made by and what it cost the people who made it. Now let us turn to the specific question of guest appearances, which is a smaller controversy than the major entries on our list, but one that illustrates something important about the show's institutional behavior. The Simpsons, in its early seasons, handled guest appearances with considerable restraint and genuine creative purpose. The celebrity guests who appeared in the show's first several seasons were chosen because they served specific creative purposes, because their presence in a given episode did something interesting, rather than just generating the attention that a celebrity appearance generates. The paradigm shift that the coma theory identifies in the celebrity flood of the later seasons is real, though its explanation is institutional rather than metaphysical. As the show became a cultural phenomenon, the strategic value of guest appearances changed. They went from serving the creative work to serving the marketing strategy. A celebrity guest in Season 4 was there because the story needed them. A celebrity guest in Season 15 was there because their presence would generate press coverage and remind the general public that The Simpsons was still on the air and still culturally relevant enough to attract famous people. The difference is visible in the episodes themselves. The early guest appearances are embedded in specific narratives with specific purposes. The later guest appearances are often structured primarily around the appearance itself, with the episode's plot being arranged to create a context in which the celebrity can do the thing they do in a Springfield setting. This is a subtle but significant distinction. It is the difference between a tool and a strategy, and it is connected to the broader pattern of the show, using the machinery of entertainment rather than the substance of creative vision to maintain its position. The handling of guest appearances is not a major controversy in itself, but it is a reliable indicator of the show's creative health at any given point in its history. When the guests serve the work is probably healthy. When the work serves the guests, the work is probably in trouble. Let us spend some time with the question of Lisa Simpson specifically. Lisa is the most intellectually honest character in Springfield's history. She is the one who keeps asking the questions that the town would prefer to leave unasked. She is the one whose intelligence is presented as both a gift and a burden. She is the one who sees things clearly and suffers for seeing them. And she is the character who, in many ways, has been treated most inconsistently across the show's run. In the early seasons, Lisa's intelligence is not just depicted but interrogated. The show asks what it means to be the smartest person in a room that does not value intelligence. It asks what the cost of clarity is in a community built on comfortable fictions. It asks whether the specific kind of loneliness that accompanies genuine insight can be compensated for by the insight itself. These are not easy questions, and the show does not answer them easily. Lisa suffers in ways that feel earned and genuine, and her suffering is connected to real observations about the world, rather than being manufactured for dramatic effect. The later Lisa is often reduced to a spokesperson. She champions causes. She makes arguments. She delivers lines that express progressive positions on whatever issue the episode has decided to address. These positions are frequently correct, in the sense that they represent the conclusions that careful thinking tends to reach. But they are delivered in a way that is less interested in the cost of those positions to the person holding them and more interested in the rhetorical expression of the positions themselves. The difference is the difference between a character and a mouthpiece. The early Lisa is interesting because she is a child who has worked her way to difficult conclusions in a world that discourages the working and resists the conclusions. The difficulty of the journey is visible. The cost is present. The intelligence is not just displayed but tested. The later Lisa delivers the conclusion without the journey. She arrives already knowing, and knowing without the visible work of coming to know is performance rather than character. This is a criticism that the show's defenders will resist, and they are not entirely wrong to resist it. There are late-period Lisa episodes that get it right, that reconnect with the specific texture of what makes the character extraordinary. But they are exceptions within a pattern, and the pattern is the problem. The controversy of what the show did to Lisa is connected to what the show did to Homer, to what the show did to every character who had genuine complexity in the early years. The process is the same. The complexity that required care and attention is replaced gradually by the trait that requires only recognition. The character that asked you to think is replaced by the character that asks you to remember. And the specific tragedy of Lisa's reduction is that she was the character the show used to argue for the value of thinking. The character who embodied the claim that intelligence, honesty, and the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions was worth something even when it cost everything. Reducing her to a mouthpiece is, within the show's own logic, a kind of betrayal. Not of the character in isolation, of the argument the character represented. The question of the Treehouse of Horror episodes deserves some attention as a separate case. The annual Halloween specials occupy a unique position in the show's history. They are explicitly non-canonical. They are announced as such. They take place in alternate universes, in horror movie parody scenarios, in deliberately outlandish situations that the show has never pretended to square with the established continuity of Springfield's regular timeline. This special status has allowed the Treehouse of Horror episodes to function as a creative pressure valve. They are where the show can be darkest, most experimental, most willing to kill characters and destroy the world and go places the regular episodes cannot reach. They are, frequently, the most energetically ambitious thing the show produces in any given season, even in the periods when the regular show has been operating at a diminished level. The controversy around the Treehouse of Horror episodes is not about any specific instance, but about what the existence of the pressure valve suggests about the show's relationship to risk in its main canon. If the non-canonical episodes are consistently more ambitious than the canonical ones, that is evidence that the show's primary creative mode has become risk management. The Treehouse of Horror episodes can take risks because they are insulated from consequences. The regular episodes cannot take risks because the franchise has become too expensive to absorb the cost of failure. This creates a specific distortion in how the show's creativity is distributed. The most interesting, most experimental, most willing to fail work happens in the officially consequence-free space. The canonical work, the work that actually builds the world and develops the characters and contributes to the ongoing story of Springfield, operates within much tighter constraints. The creative energy flows into the space where it is least expensive to have it, and away from the space where it would be most valuable. That is, in miniature, the story of the show's entire creative arc. The valuable work, the risky work, the work that costs something and might fail and produces real things when it does not fail, becomes increasingly contained to spaces where its cost is minimized and its consequences are safely bounded. And the everyday show, the canonical show, the show that most people think of when they think of The Simpsons, continues in the relatively safe middle ground. Functional, occasionally inspired, never fully committed. That is not where great art lives. Great art lives at the edge where failure is always possible and sometimes happens and is worth the risk anyway. The Simpsons spent its golden age at that edge. It has spent most of the time since finding ways to get the creative credit of appearing to be at the edge without actually accepting the cost of being there. Now I want to spend some time with something that rarely gets sufficient discussion in these kinds of retrospectives: the composers and the music. The Simpsons has, across its entire run, employed some of the most inventive musical composition in the history of American television. The show's scoring, the way the music works in and around the jokes and the emotional beats, is genuinely extraordinary. The composers have maintained a level of craft and ambition that has not noticeably diminished in the way that the writing has. This is interesting for the following reason. The music of The Simpsons, across all 36 seasons, is a continuous thread. A listener who does not speak English and cannot follow the dialogue could track the show's emotional arc entirely through the music, and that arc, the way the music still reaches for genuineness even in episodes where the writing has settled for less, tells you something important. The music suggests that the people making the show at every level still care about the craft, still bring genuine investment to the work, still believe at some level that what they are making is worth making well. And that belief is not nothing. It is actually, in the context of everything else we have discussed tonight, quite moving, because the failure modes we have been examining are institutional failures, failures of the system rather than failures of the individuals working within it. The individual composers, the individual writers in their better moments, the individual directors and voice actors and animators continue to bring genuine craft to a project that the institutional structure has compromised. The best work The Simpsons produces in its current era is best because the people doing it have not given up. They are working inside a system that was not designed to produce great work anymore, and they are still occasionally producing great work anyway through the sheer force of professional commitment and personal pride. That is worth acknowledging. The show's failures are institutional. The craft, at the level of individual contribution, is often still there. And this is maybe the most honest thing that can be said about a show that has lasted 36 years and produced both extraordinary work and extraordinary mishandlings. The people who made it, at every stage of its history, tried. The system they were working within did not always allow the trying to become the thing it was capable of becoming. The institutional pressures, the network requirements, the franchise obligations, the commercial realities of maintaining the most valuable brand in the history of animated television, all of these are real, and they constrain what even the most talented people can produce. The controversies on our list are the records of those constraints, of the moments when the constraints won, when the institutional pressure overcame the creative instinct, when the comfortable choice was made instead of the right one. But the record also contains the evidence of what the people involved were capable of before the constraints became overwhelming. That record is Springfield. The version of Springfield that still exists in 36 seasons of episodes, imperfect and inconsistent, and brilliant in the places where the craft overcame the constraints and reached for something real. That Springfield is worth defending, worth understanding, worth the time it takes to sit with it and think carefully about what it was and what it became and why. Even at its worst, The Simpsons is the product of extraordinary people doing their best. At its best, it is something that American television may never see again. And the controversies, the mishandlings, the ranked record of everything the writers got wrong or failed to get right, all of it only exists because the show they were failing to live up to was worth living up to. You can only fall short of something great. The Simpsons gave them something great to fall short of. That is, in the end, the most honest accounting, outro, closing thoughts, and the long night in Springfield. We have been in Springfield for a while now. We have walked through every major controversy. We have examined the record. We have tried to be honest about what the show got right and what it got wrong and why the distinction matters. And I want to end not with an argument, but with something quieter. The Simpsons has been part of the cultural background of most of the world for 36 years. Not just in America. Not just in the English-speaking world. The show has been translated and broadcast in dozens of countries. The characters are recognizable in places where the context that produced them is not. The yellow faces and the four fingers and the overbites are as recognizable as any icon of American popular culture produced in the second half of the 20th century. That means something. That kind of reach, that kind of cultural penetration, does not happen by accident, and it does not happen simply through commercial distribution. It happens because something in the show speaks to something that is not specific to any single culture or context. What speaks is the family, whatever the controversies, whatever the mishandlings, whatever the institutional decisions that compromise the show's creative integrity, or the specific episodes that should have been handled differently, or the characters who deserved better than what they were given. The family at the center of everything is still there, still on the couch on Evergreen Terrace, still imperfect and complicated and loud and occasionally terrible to each other and fundamentally, stubbornly, sometimes heartbreakingly devoted to being a family. Homer and Marge, who chose each other in the beginning and keep choosing each other in every episode that has the courage to be honest about what that choice costs. Bart, who is still 10 years old and still in trouble and still underneath the trouble. A kid who wants his father's approval and his sister's respect and the world's acknowledgement that being a certain kind of person is not the same thing as being worthless. Lisa, who is still 8 years old and still the smartest person in every room she enters and still lonely in the specific, aching way that intelligence can make you lonely, and still asking the questions that the town would rather leave unasked because she cannot help it, because asking the questions is what she is. And Maggie, still silent, still watching, still behind the pacifier with those enormous eyes, processing everything, waiting, whatever the controversies, whatever the declines, whatever the institutional failures and the creative mishandlings and the long gradual erosion of what made the show extraordinary, the family is still there. And the reason the controversies hurt, the reason the mishandlings generate the kind of grief that attaches to them 30 years later, is precisely that the family is still there, that the thing being mishandled is something that people love, that the thing being compromised is something that meant something real to real people in the real world, not just as entertainment but as a kind of home. Springfield is a place that millions of people have lived in the way that fictional places become real when they are loved enough, when they are allowed to be part of the furniture of a life. When they are the place you went when you needed to go somewhere that was not your actual life, that was funnier and stranger and darker and more honest about certain things than your actual life, but that contained, at its center, a family that you could believe in. The controversies are part of that. The mishandlings are part of that. Even the decline is part of that, in the way that the decline of anything beloved is part of the experience of loving it. You cannot love something for 36 years without the loving itself becoming part of your story, without the show's history becoming, in some small way, intertwined with your own, without the specific episodes from the specific years when you were watching becoming markers of where you were and who you were and what you needed. That is what the show did. That is what it still does, in its better moments. That is why we are still here, 36 seasons in, still arguing about which season was the best, still getting angry about the controversies, Still hoping, sometimes, that the next episode will be one of the ones that reaches back to what the show was when it was reaching for something real. Still going home to Evergreen Terrace? Still watching? Because it is still, in its way, home. And you do not stop loving a home just because it has gotten complicated. You argue about it. You grieve what it used to be. You get angry at the people responsible for the changes. You make lists of everything that should have been done differently, and then you sit down on the couch. And you watch. Because it is still Springfield. And Springfield, for better and for worse, in all its yellow, four-fingered, radiation-soaked, controversy-generating, magnificently imperfect glory, is where we live. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. For the long hours in Springfield, if you have been watching from somewhere interesting, from some corner of the world where Springfield reached you through a screen and spoke to you in its particular language, drop it in the comments. I want to know where this lands. I want to know who spent their evening here with us, in this strange, complicated town that exists nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. And if you have made it all the way to the end of this, if you have been here through all 36 seasons of controversy and mishandling and occasional extraordinary grace, you are exactly the kind of person who has always understood what the show at its best was trying to do. You are the person who never stopped looking. That is the most Springfield thing there is. See you in the next one. The plant is still running. The lights are still on. End of script. Total word count target. 40,000 plus words. Expanded section. The full story of the Poochie controversy. Deeper dive. Let us go back to Poochie and spend more time there. Because the episode deserves more than a summary, and because the controversy it represents is more layered than it first appears. The year is 1997. The show is in its 8th season. It has been running for 8 years, and it is, in the estimation of nearly everyone paying close attention at the time, the best show on American television. Not the best animated show, the best show, period. The number of critical superlatives being deployed in its direction during this specific window, roughly 1993 to 1997, is staggering. Critics who had spent careers covering prestige drama were writing about The Simpsons as something that redefined what the medium was capable of. Academics were writing papers, cultural essayists were producing serious analyses, and the show was handling the weight of this reputation in the specific way that great creative enterprises sometimes handle the weight of being great, which is by using the reputation as material. By looking at what being successful in the specific American commercial television landscape actually means, what the forces are that apply to success, what they do to the thing that is successful, and making work about that. The Itchy and Scratchy and Poochie show is, among many other things, an episode made by people who knew they were working inside a system that would eventually do to their show what the episode depicts being done to the fictional show within the show. It is preemptive self-diagnosis. It is the show looking at its own future with a clarity that is simultaneously impressive and melancholy, because the knowledge that a thing will happen does not typically prevent the thing from happening. Let us look at the specific details of how the Poochie character is created within the episode, because those details are not incidental, they are the argument. The network executives at the fictional Itchy and Scratchy International decide they need a new character because the existing show is losing viewers. The process by which they arrive at Poochie is worth examining in detail. It begins with market research. Focus groups of children are assembled and shown images of various potential characters. The children are asked what they find appealing. The answers are compiled. The data is analyzed. And from the data, a character profile is assembled. The character should be cool, should have attitude, should be relatable to contemporary youth, should reflect current trends in youth culture, should be visually distinctive in ways that photograph well for promotional materials. Everything about this process is wrong, in the specific way that creative decisions made by committee are wrong. Not wrong in the sense that each individual step is irrational. Market research is not inherently irrational. Focus groups are not inherently useless. Understanding your audience is not inherently a creative failure. The wrongness is in the application, in the use of external data to make decisions that should be made from internal creative conviction, in the substitution of consumer preference for artistic vision, In the fundamental error of believing that you can build toward authenticity from the outside in, assembling it from ingredients identified in research, rather than discovering it through the process of genuine creative engagement. The result is Poochie, and Poochie is wrong in the way that all synthetically constructed attempts at authenticity are wrong. He is not bad because no effort went into him. He is bad because the effort that went into him was effort applied to the wrong problem. The problem being solved when Poochie is created is not the creative problem of how to make Itchy and Scratchy more interesting. The problem being solved is the commercial problem of how to reverse declining ratings numbers. And commercial problems and creative problems, while related, are not the same problem, and solving the commercial problem through creative means requires starting from the creative problem rather than using the creative process as a service function for the commercial one. Homer's involvement is important here. Homer auditions for the Poochie role genuinely. He researches, he prepares, he brings something of himself to the audition, and when he gets the part, he continues to approach it with genuine investment. The speech he records near the end of the episode, the speech that the executives override, is the product of real thought about who Poochie is and what he might mean, and it is, within the context of what the episode is doing, the most interesting version of the character that could exist. Homer's Poochie has specificity and texture and is recognizably the product of a human being's genuine creative engagement rather than a committee's brand-building exercise. The executives do not want that version. They want the version that fits the profile the focus groups produced. They replace Homer's speech with a caption. Now, imagine you are a writer on The Simpsons in 1997, writing this episode. You are writing a scene in which a character's genuine creative work is overridden by executive decision in which the human investment of a real person trying to do something meaningful is discarded in favor of the most expedient possible solution to a commercial problem. You are writing this from experience, not necessarily this specific experience, but the experience of having your work evaluated primarily in terms of its commercial utility, of having genuine creative decisions made by people whose primary responsibility is not creative, of living within a system that values the output of creative work without particularly valuing the process that produces it. The episode is cathartic in the way that all good satire is cathartic. It names something real and makes it laugh at itself. It gives the people who experience the thing being satirized the specific relief of seeing their experience accurately reflected and given a name. You are not imagining it. The thing is real. Here it is, anatomized on screen, rendered as absurdism, so accurate it functions as documentation. But the catharsis does not change the thing. The episode aired. The writers went back to work. The network continued to have the opinions it had. The commercial pressures continued to apply. And the show, gradually, became the thing the episode had diagnosed. Not immediately. Not in the 8th season, or the 9th, or even the 10th. The decline was gradual enough that it did not feel like a single catastrophic decision, but like a slow drift, a barely perceptible movement away from the center of what the show had been. And the specific mechanisms of the drift were the mechanisms the Poochie episode had described, the new characters. The celebrity appearances arranged for attention rather than for story. The plots generated by commercial considerations as much as creative ones. The gradual subordination of what the show had to say to what the show had to sell. The episode described the disease with perfect accuracy. The patient caught it anyway. That is the full tragedy of the Poochie controversy, and it is a tragedy worth dwelling on because it is not unique to The Simpsons. It is the characteristic tragedy of commercial art in the American television system. The system selects for a specific kind of success and then applies the pressures that made the success possible to the work that achieved it, and the pressures deform the work until it is no longer the thing that earned the success, but is instead the management of the memory of that thing. The Simpsons was fortunate in one specific way. It was self-aware enough to see this coming and to put that self-awareness on screen in a form that would outlast the process it was describing. The Poochie episode will exist forever as the clearest possible articulation of what happened to The Simpsons, told by The Simpsons, before it finished happening. That is something. It is not everything, but it is something. Expanded section. The full depth of the Apu controversy. The Apu controversy requires more careful unpacking than it sometimes receives. because the terms of the debate were often simplified in ways that obscured the most interesting and most important aspects of what was actually being argued. The simplest version of the controversy is, a community found a character harmful. The show responded dismissively. The dismissal was itself harmful. And eventually the character was quietly disappeared without any genuine engagement with the substance of the criticism. That version is accurate, but it leaves out the complexity. Hank Azaria, who voiced Apu for the show's entire run, has spoken with considerable honesty and self-reflection about his own relationship to the controversy and its resolution. In interviews following his decision to step away from the role, Azaria was specific and genuine about the process he went through. He spoke about conversations he had with people of South Asian descent, about what he heard when he listened, about how his understanding changed through the process of actually engaging with the perspective of the people affected rather than the people defending the show's right to make the choice. This is not nothing. The journey Azaria described, the willingness to listen, the willingness to have his understanding changed, the decision to act on the changed understanding even when acting meant giving up a significant and long-standing professional role, is a model of how individuals can respond to the kind of criticism the show received. The show itself did not model this. The show's response, the Lisa Shrug, was notably not the response of an institution that had listened with the same care Azaria eventually brought to the question. The shrug reframed the criticism as political pressure rather than as a sincere and documented argument. It positioned the people raising the issue as an external force, imposing constraints on the show, rather than as people making a legitimate claim about the consequences of the show's choices. This distinction matters enormously. When a criticism is reframed as external political pressure, the institution is positioned as a defender of creative freedom against constraint. The narrative is about the freedom of art to exist without apology. The people making the criticism are positioned as censors, as humorless enforcers of political correctness, as people who want art to be comfortable rather than challenging. When a criticism is received as a sincere argument about the consequences of creative choices, the institution is positioned as responsible for examining those consequences and responding thoughtfully. The narrative is about the obligation of influential creative enterprises to take seriously the effects of their work on the people it affects. The people making the criticism are positioned as stakeholders whose perspective should inform the institution's understanding of itself. The first framing is defensive. The second is responsive. The show chose the first, and the choice of the first framing reveals something about how the show understood its own authority. An institution that genuinely respects the communities it depicts would not, upon receiving a sincere argument that its depiction of a community had caused harm, respond with a shrug. The shrug is the response of an institution that has concluded that its right to depict is more important than the experiences of the people depicted. This is a view that has a long history in American entertainment and in American culture more broadly. The view that creative expression operates in a space above or outside the normal obligations of respect and consideration that govern other kinds of communication. The view that the fictional frame insulates content from the responsibility to consider its effects. This view is not crazy. There are genuine arguments for robust creative freedom and against the idea that art's primary obligation is to avoid causing discomfort to any audience. Strong art is often uncomfortable. Strong satire often targets what is real and what is painful. The history of great art that someone found harmful is long and includes work that is now considered essential to human culture. But the view is not unlimited, and the specific case of caricature depiction of minority communities is one of the areas where the view's limits are most clearly visible. The argument that creative freedom permits any form of depiction, regardless of its effects on the depicted community, is strongest when the depiction involves powerful institutions and weakest when it involves communities that lack the power to respond effectively to how they are depicted. The argument for Apu is not that the show had no right to create a South Asian character. The argument is that the specific character created, in the specific context of its predominance in American popular culture's representation of South Asian people, functioned in ways that had documentable effects on real people, and that an institution with the show's influence and reach had a responsibility to engage with those effects seriously rather than dismissively. The show declined the responsibility. And the aftermath, The quiet removal of Apu rather than the creative engagement with what to do about him is its own kind of statement. A statement that says, this character was valuable when he was uncomplicated and is now a liability, and liabilities are managed by reduction. But the people of South Asian descent who grew up with Apu, who experienced both the moments when he was genuinely well-written and the moments when he was a caricature used to make them uncomfortable, deserved better than management. They deserved a creative engagement that acknowledged what the character had been in both its dimensions, that was honest about the failure and honest about what might have been done differently, and that made a genuine attempt to find a path through the problem rather than around it. The show did not provide that. The show managed. The show reduced. The show disappeared. That is the handling in full. And it is inadequate to the criticism that was raised, which was itself, at its core, a sincere engagement with the show's work by people who present thought carefully about it. The people who raised the Apu criticism were not dismissing the show. They were taking it seriously enough to examine its effects carefully and document them and make an argument. That is what you do with something that matters to you. The show's response suggested it did not take the criticism with the same seriousness the criticism had been offered. That gap is the controversy. Expanded section: the Frank Grimes episode and its lasting implications. Homer's Enemy is the episode that The Simpsons was always threatening to make and probably should have made more often. Not the same episode, obviously, not another Frank Grimes. But the kind of episode that Homer's Enemy represents? An episode that introduces a character who operates by the actual rules of a functioning world and uses that character's encounter with Springfield to force the audience to look at what Springfield actually is, rather than what the show typically allows it to be presented as. The early seasons had versions of this, not as explicit as Homer's Enemy, not as direct in their critique of Homer's existence, but present in various forms. There were characters who noticed things, who asked questions, who were not entirely insulated from the laws of cause and effect that Springfield typically suspends for its main cast. But Homer's Enemy is the most extreme version, the most explicit, the most willing to be uncomfortable, the most direct in its identification of what Homer's world actually represents to someone who is not protected by the show's structural need to keep him comfortable. What Frank Grimes represents is the introduction of actual economic reality into a show that has always depicted economic anxiety while insulating its main characters from economic consequences. Homer is working class. The show has always been explicit about this. He has a working class job, a working class education, working class anxieties about money and status, and the gap between what he has and what he feels he should have. This is one of the show's most consistent and most important commitments, to take the material life of a working-class American family seriously as a subject for storytelling. But Homer, for all his working-class identity, does not experience the actual economic vulnerability that characterizes working-class life in America. He cannot be fired. His job security is essentially supernatural. He has been protected from the consequences of his incompetence by a deal struck between his father and his employer, and by the show's own need to have Homer at the plant every week. Frank Grimes earns his position through actual effort and actual achievement. He has the credentials. He has done the work. He has overcome genuine obstacles through genuine persistence. And he is placed next to Homer. The episode forces the comparison with a brutality that is unusual for the show. It does not allow the audience to both like Homer and feel comfortable about his existence in the way that most episodes allow. It demands a reckoning. It says, this is what Homer's world actually means for the people around him who do not have his narrative protection. This is what it looks like from the outside. The outside, in Frank Grimes' case, is unbearable. There is a specific scene in the episode that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Homer invites Grimes to his home for dinner. It is a gesture of genuine, if oblivious, goodwill on Homer's part. He is trying to be kind. He is trying to include the new colleague who does not seem happy. And what Grimes finds at the house is everything he has been denied. The pictures on the wall, evidence of extraordinary experiences that Homer has stumbled into without earning. The photographs with celebrities and presidents and cultural figures. The physical record of a life that has been given adventure and recognition and reward, not through merit but through the specific quality of being Homer, of being protected by the show's need to generate interesting material for its main character. Grimes cannot process this. His mental framework, the framework that says effort produces reward and merit produces recognition, has no room for what Homer's house represents. The house is not a product of merit. It is a product of narrative convenience. And Grimes, who operates by the laws of a world where narrative convenience does not exist, has no way to reconcile what he sees with any coherent understanding of how the world works. This is the episode's darkest insight. Not that Homer is unfair to Grimes. Homer is not being deliberately unfair to Grimes. Homer is, within his own understanding of the world, being perfectly reasonable. He cannot see what his existence represents to Grimes because his existence has always been his. He does not have the framework to understand what it means from the outside. The darkness is in the gap between the two frameworks. In the show's honest depiction of two people living in the same physical space but in entirely different experiential realities, one in which the laws of consequence apply and one in which they do not, Frank Grimes cannot survive in Homer's reality. His framework breaks. He tries to operate by Homer's logic, to ignore the rules the same way Homer ignores them, and the rules, which Homer has never had to reckon with because the show protects him, apply to Grimes with their full force. He dies touching wires that Homer would survive touching, because Homer always survives. The question the episode raises and the show refuses to pursue is, who else in Springfield is Frank Grimes? Who else is operating by the actual rules in a world where certain people are insulated from those rules? Who else is experiencing the full weight of cause and effect in a Springfield that distributes its narrative protection unevenly? The answer, if the show had the courage to ask it, is most of Springfield. Most of the residents of the town are not Homer. They are not insulated from consequences. They work at the plant under the actual safety violations. They drink the water that is actually contaminated. They live in the shadow of the cracked cooling towers, with the full weight of that shadow, without Homer's superhuman constitution, and without the show's investment in keeping them alive and functional for the next episode. Frank Grimes is the representative of all of them. The person whose encounter with Homer's world makes visible what that world costs the people within it who are not its protagonist. The show killed him and moved on, which is what the show always does with the people who make the cost visible. It moves on. Expanded section. The full history of character flanderization with specific examples. The process of flanderization was not instantaneous and it was not applied equally to all characters. Understanding how it happened requires looking at specific cases in detail because the specific mechanisms vary in interesting ways that illuminate what was actually happening in the writer's room. Let us start with the clearest case, Ned Flanders himself. The early Ned Flanders is a character with genuine theological complexity. His faith is not simple. The show, in its best episodes featuring Ned, takes seriously both the consolations of his religion and its costs. There are episodes in the early seasons where Ned's faith is tested in ways that the show treats with care, where his relationship to God is depicted as something that requires ongoing work and is not always comfortable. His faith is not a costume. It is a genuine, complicated, earned part of who he is. There is a Season 3 episode called When Flanders Failed, where Homer, having wished ill on Ned's business venture in a moment of petty jealousy, is confronted with the reality that the wish has come true and that Ned's family is suffering because of it. Homer's guilt, the way he grapples with having wanted something bad to happen to someone who had done nothing to deserve it, is the emotional center of the episode. But Ned's response to his failing business is also carefully handled. His faith does not insulate him from genuine difficulty. His confidence that things will work out has limits that the show acknowledges honestly. That is a complex Ned. A Ned whose faith is not simply a character shorthand but a genuine aspect of his psychology that the show treats with the same seriousness it treats Homer's flaws and virtues. The later Ned is a different kind of character. His faith becomes the primary lens through which every single thing is filtered. Every episode featuring Ned becomes, at some level, an episode about his faith. His faith is no longer one aspect of a complete person, but the complete person, the defining and almost exclusive characteristic through which the show understands him. His other qualities, his genuine warmth, his specific loneliness, his history as a person who was shaped by a specific kind of psychological intervention, these exist only insofar as they serve the religious characterization, rather than existing as independent dimensions of a complete person. The specific moment when this transition becomes irreversible is difficult to identify with precision because it happens gradually. But there is a period in approximately seasons 10 through 13 where Ned's religious identity shifts from being one of several genuine characteristics to being the reliable engine of comedy in any scene he is in. This is the mechanism of Flanderization at its most visible. The writers, under the pressure of 22 episodes a season and the need to generate comic material efficiently, discover that a character's most immediately deployable quality can be used as a reliable engine. The engine always works. It generates predictable comedy. It requires less setup because the audience already knows what to expect. And so the engine gets used more often than the other, less reliable qualities that made the character interesting. Over time, the engine becomes the character. The other qualities atrophy from disuse. The character is no longer someone you discover as you watch. They are someone you recognize. Recognition is not the same as discovery. Discovery requires that the character retain the capacity to surprise you, that there is still something you do not know about them, something that the next episode might reveal, some dimension that has not yet been fully explored. Discovery is what makes you want to keep watching. It is what makes individual episodes feel significant rather than interchangeable. Recognition gives you comfort. It gives you the specific pleasure of seeing a familiar thing. But comfort and pleasure, while genuinely good, are not what makes television great. Great television makes you feel something you did not expect to feel, think something you did not expect to think, understand something you did not previously understand. It does this by surprising you, by going somewhere you were not expecting, by refusing to be simply what you already knew it was. Flanderized characters cannot surprise you. They can only confirm what you already know about them. Principal Skinner's arc is particularly interesting because it intersects with the Armin-Tamzarian controversy in ways that make both more complicated. Before the Tamzarian reveal, Skinner is a character with genuine depth. His military history, while occasionally played for comedy, is treated as something real that shaped him in real ways. His relationship with Agnes is funny, but the comedy is rooted in observed truth about a specific kind of adult-child relationship, the kind where the child has never fully separated from the parent, and the parent has never fully encouraged the separation. His dynamic with Bart has genuine stakes because Skinner actually cares about the school, because the school is the thing that gives his life meaning, and Bart's attacks on the school are experienced by Skinner as genuine threats to something valuable. After the Tamzarian reveal, all of this is destabilized, not necessarily destroyed. The show could, theoretically, have used the revelation to deepen Skinner's character rather than diminishing it. The question of who Armin Tamzarian is, what he became by inhabiting a stolen identity, what the relationship between his authentic self and his performed self actually is after 20 years, is genuinely interesting territory. But the show did not go there. The show went back to Skinner as engine, the authority figure undermined by his mother machine, and ran it for another decade plus without engaging with what the Tamzarian reveal should have changed. The result is a character who is simultaneously over-explained and underdeveloped. We know more about Skinner's history than we ever needed to know, and we understand him less as a person than we did before the reveal happened. Chief Wiggum's Flanderization is interesting in a different way because it reveals how Flanderization interacts with the show's political and social commentary. In the early seasons, Chief Wiggum is corrupt and lazy in ways that are connected to a specific critique of small-town policing, of the relationship between institutional authority and personal accountability, of the specific way that small communities enable the failure of their institutions by demanding the comfortable fiction of competent protection over the uncomfortable reality of its absence. That critique is genuine social commentary. It is the show doing what the show does best, using a character to make an argument about something real. The later Wiggum is stupid, just stupid. Not corrupt in ways that are connected to anything larger. Not lazy in ways that illuminate anything about how institutions function, just incompetent as a reliable engine for comedic situations requiring a police presence. The social commentary has been stripped out and replaced with the engine. This is what Flanderization does to the show's capacity for genuine critique. It converts the characters from instruments of argument into instruments of comedy. And while comedy and argument are not mutually exclusive, the comedy that a Flanderized character generates is comedy of recognition rather than comedy of surprise, which means it cannot easily carry a genuine argument. Arguments require the audience to be moved to a new position. Recognition comedy moves you to the place you already were. The accumulated effect of flanderization across the major cast is the primary reason the show's capacity for genuine social satire diminished so significantly in its middle and later periods. Not because the show ran out of things to say, but because the instruments it had used to say things were no longer sharp enough to say them effectively. A flanderized Springfield cannot tell you anything you did not already know about Springfield, because flanderized characters can only confirm what is already known. They cannot reveal, they cannot argue, they cannot push into territory that is genuinely new. And a Springfield that cannot reveal or argue cannot do what Springfield was built to do. Expanded section. The deeper story of the Burns Mystery Contest. The national contest around who shot Mr. Burns is worth understanding in its full commercial context, because the context changes how the mishandling reads. In the summer of 1995, The Simpsons was at or near the peak of its commercial dominance. Fox was using the show as the centerpiece of its primetime strategy. The network had, in the show's first several seasons, built its audience and its reputation in significant part on the show's performance and the cultural conversation it generated. The contest was not just a creative experiment, it was a marketing strategy. Fox and the show's producers understood that the cliffhanger mystery generated a specific kind of attention, a sustained, active, participatory kind of attention that was becoming increasingly valuable in a media landscape where passive viewership was the norm. Inviting the audience to participate, to invest intellectually in the show's mystery, to become agents rather than spectators, was a way of converting the show's audience from viewers into stakeholders. This was sophisticated marketing. It was also, whether the people involved fully intended it or not, a commitment to a specific kind of artistic integrity. The commitment that the mystery was real, that it had an answer embedded in the evidence, that the audience could find that answer if they were attentive and smart. That commitment was not fully honored, not because the answer was necessarily wrong. Maggie as the shooter has its own logic, but because the process by which the answer was arrived at, the cycling through multiple shooters, the reverse engineering of clues, the production of full alternate endings, suggests that the mystery did not have a single predetermined answer that a careful viewer could have discovered. The show promoted the contest as if the answer was knowable from the existing evidence. The evidence turned out to be insufficient to produce the answer without the additional context of knowing what the writers ultimately chose. The gap between the promotion and the reality is the specific mishandling. And the gap is not small. The gap is the difference between a puzzle with a solution embedded in it and a puzzle that was constructed backwards. Between a mystery that respects its audience's intelligence by hiding an answer in the available evidence and a mystery that simulates respect for the audience's intelligence while keeping the actual answer in the writers, room until the promotional benefit of the reveal has been maximized. The contest nobody won is the most direct evidence of this gap. If the mystery was solvable from the clues, some reasonable percentage of the many thousands of entries should have guessed correctly. The fact that essentially no one did, combined with the show's own acknowledgement that one person posted the right answer but was never found to claim the prize, is either evidence that the clues were insufficient or evidence that the answer was not what the clues most naturally pointed toward. Both possibilities are damaging to the show's implied promise to its audience. And the way the mystery was subsequently treated, Homer's throwaway confession in Season 18, the show's occasional willingness to treat the Maggie answer as provisional rather than definitive, the fact that the alternate endings were so fully produced that they could be shown in a clip special, all of this suggests that the writers themselves never fully committed to the Maggie answer as the true and inevitable resolution of the mystery. The most honest reading of the Burns mystery is that it was a mystery that was not fully constructed before it was promoted. The answer was chosen after the mystery had been built, and the mystery was built in ways that were designed to create excitement and participation rather than to encode a genuine puzzle. The promotion implied the latter. The reality was the former. The gap between them is the controversy. What makes this number 4 on the list rather than higher is that the episode itself is excellent. Both parts of Who Shot Mr. Burns are among the show's most ambitious and most entertaining. The mystery format, The deliberate construction of motive and opportunity for the entire cast of Springfield, the comedic procedural of the investigation, the specific quality of attention the episode brings to each suspect, all of this is genuinely good work. The mishandling is in the promotional frame, not the creative work. The creative work earns the attention. The promotional frame made promises about the nature of the mystery that the creative work had not actually fulfilled. That is a specific and important distinction. The show was better than its promotion of the show, which is, compared to the many cases where the opposite is true, a relatively honorable failure. Expanded section: the slow death of the emotional Simpsons. There is a specific register that The Simpsons operated in during its best years that is almost impossible to describe without sounding either sentimental or academic. It was the register of earned emotion, of jokes that were not just funny but true, of comedic situations that carried real feeling inside them in a way that most comedy does not, of the specific experience of laughing and feeling moved at the same time, not in the way that cheap sentiment makes you feel moved, but in the way that genuine insight makes you feel moved, the way that having something you knew but had never quite articulated, shown back to you in a form that makes it suddenly, perfectly clear, produces something that is simultaneously intellectual and emotional. This is what the best episodes of The Simpsons do. They make you laugh, genuinely, at something that is simultaneously funny and deeply accurate about human experience. And the laughter is not a relief from the accuracy. The laughter is the accuracy. The joke is the truth delivered in the form that makes the truth land most effectively. The episode where Homer watches Bart and Lisa's hockey game is a useful example. The episode's comedic premise, the sibling rivalry, Homer's competitive coaching, the escalating absurdity of the situation, all of this is funny and fast and well constructed. But the emotional center of the episode is something real. A father who loves his children and does not know how to show it, and whose love is expressed in ways that cost him rather than cost his children, and whose moment of genuine communication with them comes through action rather than language. That emotional center is not sentimentalized. It is not manipulated into easy feeling. It is earned through the specific details of who Homer is and what his relationship with his children looks like when the show is paying close attention. The emotion lands because it was built accurately rather than engineered for effect. The later show, the show of the middle and late periods, occasionally produces emotional moments. But the emotion is more often engineered than earned. It is announced rather than discovered. The show tells you that you should feel something by deploying the musical cues that have become associated with emotional moments, by having characters say things that are explicitly about emotional truth rather than being emotionally true in the way they are said, by reaching for the feeling rather than working toward it. This distinction between emotion announced and emotion earned is the clearest marker of the difference between the show's golden era and its subsequent periods. And the writers handled the loss of earned emotion badly in the specific sense that they attempted to compensate for it with announced emotion, which does not work. Announced emotion is the tell that something real is missing. The audience can feel the difference between a moment that genuinely moved them and a moment that was designed to move them. The first produces genuine feeling. The second produces the faint, slightly uncomfortable sense of being manipulated. The late period Simpsons produces more of the second. The show that once made you cry at a Homer and Lisa interaction, by putting a specific, accurate, observed detail of that relationship on screen in a way that crystallized what it was, now makes you feel the prompt for crying without necessarily producing the cry. The prompt is there. The mechanism is there. The genuine feeling that filled the mechanism in the early years is less consistently present. This is a loss that is difficult to quantify but very easy to feel if you have watched both the early and the late show with attention. And it is connected directly to the Flanderization problem and the Homer problem and the Lisa problem and every other problem that involves the show's characters being less fully themselves than they once were. Earned emotion requires characters who are genuinely themselves. The emotion comes from the specificity of who these particular people are and how they relate to each other. When the specificity diminishes, when the characters become types rather than people, the emotion that depended on specificity becomes impossible to generate honestly. You can still announce that Homer loves Marge, but you cannot make it feel earned without a Homer who is specific enough for his love to be credible. The late period Homer is not specific enough for his love to be fully credible. He is too often a type, a comedy engine, a vehicle for plot, to sustain the weight of genuine feeling. And so, the show reaches for the feeling with its hands and misses it every time, or almost every time, because the exceptions are real and they are worth celebrating when they appear. But they are exceptions within a pattern, and the pattern is what we are examining tonight. Expanded section. The long shadow of the show's golden age on everything that followed. One of the most underappreciated aspects of the Simpsons controversy landscape is the specific way in which the show's golden era has functioned as an impossible standard against which everything the show produced afterward was measured. This is not, in itself, the show's fault. The show cannot be blamed for having been extraordinary. The show cannot be criticized for having established standards of quality that proved difficult to maintain indefinitely. The creation of an exceptional thing always carries the risk of setting expectations that the thing's future iterations will struggle to meet. But there is a specific decision the show made in its middle period that made the comparison more painful than it needed to be. It kept referencing its own past, not just in the general sense that every long-running show references its history, in the specific sense of returning, repeatedly, to the material of its golden age as a source of both comedy and emotional weight, callbacks to early seasons, references to beloved moments. Episodes structured around the premise that the audience remembers the golden era with the kind of fondness that the reference is designed to trigger. This is, on its face, a reasonable creative strategy. You have a legacy. The audience loves the legacy. The legacy generates positive emotion. Using the legacy to build positive emotion into new material seems rational, but it has a specific, damaging consequence. Every reference to the golden era is, implicitly, a reminder that the golden era is over. Every callback says, "Do you remember when this was what we were?" Which means it also says, "We are not currently that." The callback is simultaneously nostalgic and self-indicting. It invites the audience to feel good about what the show used to be, in a way that inevitably involves them noticing that the show is not currently that good. The late period show got into a habit of mining its own past for material in ways that were more likely to produce longing in the audience than satisfaction. The longing is real and the show is not wrong to invoke it. But invoking it without being able to answer it is a specific kind of cruelty to your own audience. You cannot ask someone to remember the best version of something and then offer them a lesser version without the gap becoming visible. The show's relationship to its own past is, in many ways, the clearest illustration of what has gone wrong. It loves the past. It references the past constantly. It knows the past was better, and it continues to make the present, which is not the past, while asking the audience to feel toward the present what they feel toward the past. This does not work. It has never worked. The audience knows the difference. And the show's inability to be honest about that difference, its insistence on presenting the current era as a continuation of the legacy rather than a management of the legacy's memory, is a specific kind of dishonesty that the audience experiences as exhaustion rather than enthusiasm. The golden era shows deserve the love they receive. The people who made them deserve the recognition. The specific episodes and seasons and moments that remain genuinely extraordinary deserve to be treated as the extraordinary things they are. What they do not deserve is to be used as a perpetual marketing mechanism for a continuation that cannot match them. The golden era is not served by being invoked to justify the ongoing existence of something that has moved significantly away from what made the golden era golden. The most honest thing the show could do with its past at this point would be to let the past be what it is. A period of extraordinary work that stands on its own terms and does not require justification by proximity to something lesser. That kind of honesty would require the show to acknowledge that the lesser thing exists. And, as we have discussed at length tonight, acknowledging uncomfortable things is not Springfield's strong suit. Extended outro. The final thoughts on a show that changed everything. We have been here for a long time now. We have been in Springfield in the way that you can be in Springfield at night, when it is quiet and the plant is humming, and the lights are on in every yellow house, and Homer is on the couch, and Bart is watching television, and Lisa is in her room playing a saxophone that she should technically be too small to hold. We have been through the full record, the 10 major controversies, the deeper dives, the patterns beneath the patterns, the institutional story, that connects every individual mishandling to a larger story about what happens when a creative enterprise becomes a franchise, and a franchise becomes an institution, and an institution becomes something that cannot afford to be honest about its own history. And I want to close with something that I think is true, and that I think gets underweighted in most discussions of The Simpsons. The controversies are real. The mishandlings are real. The decline is real and documented and sad in specific ways that anyone who loved the early show cannot avoid feeling. And the early show is also real. It is still there. All of it. Every extraordinary episode. Every moment where the show found exactly the right angle on something true and rendered it with such precision and wit that it entered the permanent record of what television can be. Every Frank Grimes, every Homer and Lisa moment that made you feel something you had not expected to feel. Every Ned Flanders episode that took the joke seriously enough to let it become something more than a joke. All of it is still there, and none of the controversies reach back in time to unmake it. The controversies tell you something important about the show and about the institutions that produced it. They are worth examining carefully and honestly. This list is an attempt at exactly that kind of careful, honest examination. But examining the failures honestly should not require pretending the achievements did not happen. Both are real. Both are part of the record. And the full record of The Simpsons, the complete arc from the extraordinary beginning to the complicated ongoing present, is one of the most fascinating, most instructive, most honest documents of American popular culture ever produced. Not because it was always great. Because it was great, and then it wasn't, and the journey from one to the other is full of specific, documented, visible decisions that tell you something real about how creative enterprises work and what they cost and what they gain and what they are willing to sacrifice in order to survive. The Simpsons is, in the end, the story of American commercial art told through the specific lens of a cartoon family in a fictional American town. It is brilliant and compromised and self-aware and self-deceived and generous and petty and honest and dishonest and all of the other things that things made by human beings inside human institutions always are. It is Springfield, and Springfield, as the show has spent 36 years demonstrating, is not a place you leave easily, even when you know everything that is wrong with it. Even when you have documented every mishandling and examined every controversy and made the full, honest accounting of the distance between what the show was and what the show became, you still go back. Because the family is still there. Because the lights are still on. Because somewhere inside the institutional noise and the franchise management and the character simplification and the decade-long decline of everything that made it extraordinary, there is still a yellow house on Evergreen Terrace with a couch in the living room and a television always on, and a family that, in its best moments, is the most honest portrait of what it is to be human in America that any piece of commercial entertainment has ever managed to produce. That is the thing worth defending. That is the thing worth the long night. That is the thing worth knowing, all the controversies by name, and all the mishandlings in detail, and all the ways the show failed to live up to what it was at its best. Because knowing all of that, holding it all in mind, and still choosing to go home to Springfield anyway, is the most Springfield thing there is. Thank you for being here. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what time it is wherever you are. Drop it in the comments and let me know who is still here, who has been in Springfield with us tonight, who stayed all the way to the end, and subscribe. Because we are going back. We always go back. That is the whole point. End of full script. Expansion. The complete record of handled and mishandled full episode-by-episode analysis of the controversies in context. Let us go through the timeline with more granular attention. Because the controversies do not exist in isolation. They exist inside specific seasons, specific creative climates, specific moments in the show's history. Understanding them fully requires understanding the context they emerged from. The first season aired in 1989 and 1990. It is, by the standards the show would set in the following years, a rough season. The animation is inconsistent. The character voices are still finding themselves. Homer's voice, in particular, is noticeably different in the earliest episodes, pitched higher and more cartoonish than the version Dan Castellaneta would settle into by the middle of the second season. But the first season is also remarkable for something that the later show would struggle to maintain, a commitment to the specific emotional texture of a working-class family's domestic life. The first season is, more than any later season, interested in the material reality of the Simpson family's existence. Homer's anxiety about money is not abstract. It is connected to specific numbers, specific fears, specific situations that the show depicts with unusual care. The Christmas episode that launched the show, Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, is a portrait of a specific kind of American desperation. Homer's attempt to provide a Christmas for his family through desperate improvisation, ending in the adoption of a greyhound rather than the traditional gifts, is funny and genuine and rooted in the kind of emotional truth that the show would build its entire reputation on. The show knew what it was from the beginning. It was a show about a family for whom the official American dream was always slightly out of reach, and the comedy was the comedy of that specific gap, which is both universal and specific to a particular class experience in America. The first season also contains early versions of most of the mishandlings that would develop more fully later. The character simplifications are already nascent. The tendency to resolve emotional complexity through comedy rather than through genuine reckoning is already present. The seeds of every later problem are visible in the first season if you know what to look for. But they are seeds, not full plants. The characters have more room to be themselves than they would have in the later seasons. The show has not yet built up the specific institutional weight that would eventually constrain it. The second season deepened everything. The show found its rhythm. The voice work settled, the animation became more consistent, the stories became more confident. The second season is where the show first became certain of what it was and began to operate from that certainty with real authority. The third season is, by most accounts, the beginning of the golden era. It is where the show first consistently achieves what would become its defining quality, the ability to be genuinely funny and genuinely moving simultaneously. The ability to land a joke that is also true. The ability to construct a scene that makes you laugh and think and feel in the same moment. There are specific episodes in the third season that could be submitted to any court of television history as evidence that something genuinely new was happening. Homer Defined, in which Homer accidentally saves the plant from meltdown and becomes a hero for reasons entirely unconnected to his own competence, is funny and dark and accurate about how celebrity and heroism function in modern culture in ways that remain relevant 30 years later. Like Father, Like Clown, is a parody of the jazz singer that takes its emotional content seriously enough to be genuinely affecting alongside the comedy. Separate Vocations, in which Bart's unexpected aptitude for law enforcement and Lisa's unexpected aptitude for rebellion reveal the fragility of both characters' self-conceptions, is one of the sharpest character studies the show ever produced. These are the seasons against which every subsequent season would be measured. And the fourth season, which contains the coma episode that gave birth to the Homer coma theory, the God conversation that preceded it, and some of the most beloved episodes in the show's entire run, is arguably the peak of the peak. The season contains Marge versus the Monorail, which many people consider the single funniest episode the show ever produced. It contains Last Exit to Springfield, the Union episode, which is widely cited by critics as the single best episode in the show's history. It contains Homer the Heretic, which is the most theologically sophisticated thing the show ever attempted and which holds up extraordinarily well under repeated viewing. It contains A Streetcar Named Marge, which is a love story and a character study and a musical parody all at once. The fourth season is the apex. Everything after the fourth season is, on some level, a negotiation with the apex, not a descent. Not immediately. The fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth seasons all contain extraordinary work. The golden era does not end with season 4, but season 4 is where the ceiling was established, and every subsequent season was measured against that ceiling, whether it wanted to be or not. The fifth season contains Homer and Apu, which is the episode that most directly addresses the character who would become a major controversy 12 years later. The episode is interesting because it is simultaneously one of the more developed treatments of Apu as a character, giving him genuine stakes and genuine emotional content, and a clear illustration of the show's primary mode for depicting him, which is as a character defined primarily by his relationship to his employer and his community rather than his interior life. The episode is good. It is also, if you look at it with the knowledge of what the controversy would eventually argue, an example of both the show's capacity to do something real with the character and its tendency to leave the most interesting territory unexplored. The sixth season contains the first half of the Burns mystery. It is the season that most explicitly engaged with the question of what the show was doing with its accumulated power. The two-part mystery, the national contest, the Fox promotional machine, all of this represents the show at the peak of its commercial dominance, attempting to use that dominance in a way that was genuinely creative, rather than purely commercial. The attempt was sincere. The execution was imperfect in specific ways that would become clear the following season. The seventh season contains what many people consider the single most emotionally devastating episode in the show's history, Mother Simpson. The episode where Homer discovers his mother is alive, where the backstory of Mona Simpson is revealed, where Burns' role in destroying the Simpson family is made explicit, ends with one of the most quietly extraordinary images the show ever produced. Homer sitting on the hood of his car, alone on the highway, watching his mother's van disappear into the night, looking up at the stars. No joke, no reset, no cutaway. Just a man watching his mother drive away for the second time in his life, and the stars and the stillness. It is the best thing the show ever did with silence. And it is from the seventh season, which is also the season where the first visible signs of the decline were beginning to appear in certain episodes. The seventh season is the last season where the golden era qualities are consistently present across the whole season rather than being present in the peaks while the valleys begin to deepen. The eighth season is where the show began the process of coming to terms with what it was becoming. The Poochie episode is from the eighth season. Homer's Enemy is from the eighth season. Both are episodes that represent the show's creative intelligence being turned on itself, on the machinery of its own production. They are extraordinary episodes. They are also, in retrospect, the last examples of the show consistently operating at that level of self-awareness and ambition. The ninth season is where the descent becomes undeniable. Not in every episode, not uniformly. There are good episodes in the ninth season, but there are also bad episodes in the ninth season in a way that there were not bad episodes in the fourth or fifth season. The floor dropped, the variance increased. The show became less consistent in a way that, once established, would define every subsequent season. The Principal and the Pauper is from the ninth season. This is not a coincidence. The ninth season is the season where the show first demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice the established weight of its own continuity for the sake of a single episode's comic premise. That willingness, once demonstrated, made every subsequent act of continuity sacrifice more likely. The show had shown itself that it could break the covenant and continue, and continuing, despite having broken the covenant, made the covenant weaker. The 10th season was, by general critical consensus, the season that sealed the argument about the show's decline. The 10th season contains episodes that, in isolated moments, reach the level of the best work. But it also contains episodes that would have been impossible in the fourth season, not because they are badly constructed, but because they are empty in a specific way that the early show was never empty. They are episodes without genuine stakes, without real feeling underneath the comedy, without the specific quality of earned emotion that the early show generated so consistently that audiences came to expect it. The 10th season is where the show became primarily a comedy rather than a comedy drama. The comedy was frequently good. The drama that had always underpinned it was less consistently present. And without the drama, the comedy was funny but not important. Funny in the way that a lot of things are funny. Not funny in the way that only The Simpsons had been funny. The 11th through 15th seasons are, in the judgment of most serious critics of the show, the weakest sustained run in its history. This is the period when most of the Flanderization reached its full development. This is the period when Homer's character had been simplified most dramatically. This is the period when the guest appearances were most obviously driven by promotional considerations rather than creative ones. This is the period when the show was least like itself at its best. This is also the period when the audience numbers were still substantial enough that the institutional pressure to continue was overwhelming. The show was declining in quality but not in commercial performance. Not yet. Not to the degree that would change the calculation about whether to continue. And so it continued, producing 22 episodes a season of work that was sometimes good and consistently less extraordinary than what had come before. The 16th through 22nd seasons saw something interesting happen. The show reached a kind of equilibrium with its own limitations. Having descended to a new level, it found its footing at that level and began to produce work that was, within the constraints of what the show had become, consistently competent and occasionally genuinely good. The peaks were lower than the golden era, but the valleys were not as deep as the worst of the middle period. This equilibrium is sometimes cited as evidence of the show's resilience, and in a narrow sense, it is. The show found a way to function sustainably at a lower altitude. It did not collapse. It did not descend into self-parody to the degree that made it impossible to watch. It maintained a level of craft and care that justified the professional commitment of the talented people working on it. But equilibrium at a lower altitude is not the same as recovery. The show at equilibrium is not the show at its best. It is the show having found a way to continue being itself at a smaller scale. The 23rd through 30th seasons are in many ways more interesting critically than the middle period precisely because they are the seasons when the show began, for the first time, to seem genuinely aware that it was a legacy property rather than a current creative event. Episodes from this period occasionally engage self-reflexively with the show's own history in ways that the middle period avoided. There is more willingness to acknowledge that the show has changed, that certain things that were once true of the show are no longer true. This self-awareness is often better than the middle period's refusal of self-awareness, but it creates its own problems. A show that is self-aware about having declined and continues anyway is a show that has made peace with its own reduction. The self-awareness does not fix the problem. It just changes the relationship to the problem from denial to acceptance. Acceptance is more honest than denial, but it is not the same as doing the hard work of actually trying to recover what has been lost. The current season, the 36th, is the show at its most nakedly institutional. It is a franchise managing itself. The episodes are produced professionally. The cast is still intact, extraordinarily. The character designs have evolved slightly but are recognizable. The voice work is as good as it has ever been from the people involved, because these are extraordinary performers who bring genuine craft to the work regardless of what the work demands of them. The show is still Springfield, but Springfield has been managed for so long that the specific quality of genuine discovery, the quality that made it possible for a viewer in 1993 to be surprised by what Springfield was and what it contained and what it was capable of, is no longer reliably available. You can still love Springfield. You can still enjoy Springfield. You can still find specific moments in current episodes that reach back to what the show was at its best and produce something that feels continuous with the early season's ambitions. But you cannot be surprised by Springfield anymore. And the inability to be surprised is the final cost of 36 seasons. The show cannot surprise you because it has been running long enough that you already know everything there is to know about how it works. The mechanisms are visible. The engines are recognizable. The tools the show uses to generate comedy and generate feeling and navigate its characters through their weekly situations are all familiar enough that you are watching craft rather than experiencing discovery. There is value in craft. There is pleasure in watching skilled people apply their skills to a familiar task. There is something genuinely comforting about returning to Springfield in the knowledge that it will be roughly what it has always been, that the characters will be recognizable, that the world will not have changed too drastically, that the couch will still be there. Comfort is not nothing, but it is not what The Simpsons was built to provide. The Simpsons was built to challenge, to illuminate, to say the true and uncomfortable thing in the form that made it impossible to ignore. It was built to surprise you into recognition, to use comedy as the vehicle for insight, to take the specific texture of ordinary American life and render it with enough clarity and honesty and wit that the rendering itself became a form of revelation. That is what was lost. That is what the controversies, each in their own way, are mourning. Not just the quality, the specific quality, the quality of genuine surprise, of earned emotion, of honest confrontation with the things the show saw clearly enough to show you clearly. The Simpsons at its best was honest in the way that great art is honest. Not comfortable, not safe, not designed to make you feel only what you were expecting to feel, but rigorously, generously, sometimes brutally truthful about the world and the people in it. The Simpsons, at its ongoing present, is something different, something softer, something more managed. Something that knows what it is and does that thing with professional skill, rather than with the creative urgency that produces genuine revelation. The difference is 36 years. The difference is everything on this list. The difference is the gap between a show that was afraid of nothing, that looked at everything including itself with total, merciless honesty, and the institution that show eventually became, which is afraid of many things, which looks at itself with the careful eye of a franchise manager rather than the unsparing eye of a satirist. The show knew the difference. The show was always showing you the difference. That is the greatest controversy of all. Not any single episode. Not any single decision. The show itself. Its life and its decline. Its extraordinary beginning and its long, complicated, still ongoing continuation. Its capacity for self-awareness and its institutional inability to act on that self-awareness when acting would have required sacrifice. The show is the controversy, and the controversy is the show. And somehow, in all of that, the yellow family on the couch in the yellow house on Evergreen Terrace is still there, still watching television together, still trying to figure out how to be a family in a world that makes it hard, still funny, still true. Sometimes, when it remembers what it is, which is still Springfield. And Springfield, even at its most managed, even at its most institutional, even at its most reduced from what it was, is still more honest about America than almost anything else American popular culture has ever produced. That is the final word. That is the whole thing. That is why we are still here. Good night from wherever you are. Good night from Springfield. The plant is still running. The lights are still on. Complete script, all sections combined. Total estimated word count, 40,000 plus words. The final extended section. The writer's room, the people behind the controversies, and the human cost of 36 seasons. We have spent this entire journey discussing controversies as if they were purely institutional events, as if the decisions were made by systems rather than by people. And that framing is useful for understanding the patterns, the way individual choices aggregate into an institutional direction, the way specific creative failures trace back to specific structural pressures. But the controversies were made by people, human beings sitting in rooms, arguing about stories, making calls under pressure, living with the consequences of those calls for years or decades afterward. And understanding the controversies fully requires spending some time with the human dimension of them. The Simpsons writer's room in its golden era was, by most accounts, one of the most intellectually intense environments in the history of American television comedy. The people in the room were extraordinarily educated in a specific way that mattered for the show's quality. Multiple Harvard and Yale graduates, people with serious academic backgrounds in mathematics, philosophy, literary criticism, and hard science. The room was capable of arguing about the narrative structure of a B-plot with the same rigor that a seminar room might bring to a contested text. This is not a description of a room that made its choices carelessly. The controversies that emerged from that room did not emerge because the people in the room were not smart enough to foresee the consequences of their choices. In many cases, they clearly were smart enough to foresee the consequences. The Poochie episode is evidence of this. Homer's enemy is evidence of this. The Frank Grimes episode is evidence that the room was fully capable of looking at itself and the world with unsparing clarity. The controversies emerged, in many cases, because the room was smart enough to understand what was happening and did not have the institutional authority to stop it. This is the specific human cost of working inside a commercial creative enterprise. You can see clearly what is wrong. You can name it. You can make the episode that names it. And then the system continues anyway, because the system's logic is not the logic of creative clarity. The system's logic is the logic of commercial survival, of institutional self-preservation, of the accumulated weight of commitments and contracts and audience expectations and network relationships that constrains what is actually possible, regardless of what is clearly desirable. The people who wrote the Poochie episode and then watched the show produce its own Poochies over the following decades were not hypocrites. They were people operating inside a system that did not give them the authority to act on their own understanding. That is a specific kind of professional grief that is rarely discussed in the coverage of television controversies, because coverage of television controversies tends to focus on the institutional rather than the human. But the human is there. There are writers who worked on the show through its golden era and then through its decline who have spoken, in various interviews and retrospectives, about what it felt like to watch the thing they helped build move in directions they did not choose. Who have described the specific experience of bringing genuine creative investment to work that was, by that point in the show's history, being shaped more by commercial forces than by the creative vision that had made it valuable. The grief in those accounts is real, and it is connected, directly, to the controversies on this list. Because every mishandling represents not just an institutional failure, but a failure that happened to specific people. The people who raised concerns about specific decisions and were overruled. The people who argued for the harder, more honest path and watched the show take the easier one. The people who cared enough about what the show was to be genuinely hurt by what it became. Those people are not abstract. They are real. And they deserve acknowledgement in any honest accounting of the show's record. The show did not become what it became because no one cared. It became what it became in spite of the fact that many of the people involved cared enormously. And that is, in its own way, the most devastating part of the story. Not the cynicism, the care that was present and was not sufficient to prevent the outcome that the care was trying to prevent. That is the human dimension of the Poochie problem. That is the human dimension of every problem on this list. Let us also spend time with something that does not get discussed enough. The specific achievement of the show's voice cast across its entire run. Dan Castellaneta, Julie Kavner, Nancy Cartwright, Yeardley Smith, Hank Azaria, Harry Shearer. These 6 performers have been the voice of Springfield for 36 years. They have brought these characters to life in every single episode, through the show's extraordinary peaks and its considerable valleys, with a level of professional commitment that is genuinely remarkable. What Castellaneta did with Homer in the early seasons is one of the great voice performances in the history of American animation. The specific emotional texture he brought to the character, the way Homer's voice could be simultaneously funny and heartbreaking, the control he had over the specific quality of Homer's emotional expression is not something that can be fully credited to the writing. The writing provides the text. What Castellaneta added was the specific quality of Homer's humanity, the voice as the carrier of genuine feeling rather than just the delivery mechanism for lines. When people describe Homer's decline as a character, they are describing primarily a writing problem. But it is worth noting that the performance itself, the voice work, has remained consistently excellent. Castellaneta has brought the same commitment to Homer in season 36 that he brought in season 3. The character he is performing has been diminished by the writing. The performance has not been diminished. This is a specific kind of artistic integrity that deserves acknowledgement separately from any criticism of the show's creative direction. The same is true of Kavner's Marge, of Smith's Lisa, of Cartwright's Bart. These are performers who have, across decades and hundreds of episodes of varying quality, maintained a consistent level of investment and craft that the show's institutional direction did not always deserve. They care about the characters. They have always cared about the characters, and the care is audible even in the weakest episodes, even in the moments when the writing is at its most mechanical and the stakes are at their lowest. The voice work maintains a quality of genuine engagement that is one of the few things the show has genuinely sustained across its entire run. This matters because it is the human counter-argument to the institutional critique. The institution has made choices that compromise the creative work. The people have continued to bring genuine craft to the work regardless of what the institution has done. The distinction between those two things is important. The criticism of the institution is not a criticism of the individuals who have served it with such sustained commitment. The question of what a responsible ending would look like is worth taking seriously, because the show has never fully engaged with it, and because the engagement, even hypothetical, illuminates something about what has been lost. A responsible ending to The Simpsons would require several things that the show's institutional structure has never been able to provide. It would require honesty about why it was ending. Not a creative decision framed as a natural conclusion. Not a retirement announcement that pretended the decision was purely artistic, but a genuine reckoning with the reasons. The creative arc has been completed. The characters have been given everything the show can give them. Continuing further would be managing a legacy rather than extending a genuine creative vision. It would require a conclusion that honored what the show was at its best rather than what it has been in its most recent seasons. An ending that reached back to the specific qualities of the early seasons, to the earned emotion, to the genuine stakes, to the specific texture of a family that loved each other imperfectly and completely, and used those qualities to close the loop in a way that felt true to the beginning. It would require giving the characters something the floating timeline has denied them for 36 years: the passage of time. An ending that acknowledged that Homer and Marge have grown, that Bart has grown, that Lisa has grown, that Maggie has grown. Not in the sense of violating the cartoon logic that has always defined the show's reality, but in the sense of finding a narrative frame that allows the characters to be seen in their completeness rather than in their eternal present. It would require saying goodbye. And saying goodbye to something you love is the hardest thing, especially if you are an institution with revenue to protect and contracts to honor and hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depend on the continuation. The goodbye has not come. It may not come. The machine may continue to run until some external force, a loss of rights, a departure of key cast members, a commercial failure significant enough to change the institutional calculation, makes the decision for the people who have not been able to make it themselves. If that happens, the goodbye will be less than the show deserves. But the show that deserves a better goodbye than the institution can provide is still the show that built Springfield. Still the show that made Homer real. Still the show that found a yellow family on a couch in a fictional American town and used them to say something true about what it is to be human in America. That show will outlast anything the institution does or fails to do with it. The best seasons of The Simpsons are already permanent. They are already part of the record of what human beings have made and left behind. The controversies and the mishandlings and the institutional compromises and the long, complicated ongoing continuation do not reach back in time to unmake them. They are what they are. They always will be what they are. And what they are is extraordinary. Full stop. Even with everything on this list. Even with the full weight of every controversy and every mishandling and every moment the show failed to live up to its own best self. Even with all of that, extraordinary. Springfield, thank you for spending the night here. It has been long. It has been worth it. Drop your time and location in the comments. Let me know where this reached you. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And get some rest. You have earned it. Springfield will still be here when you wake up. It always is. The plant is still running, the lights are still on. Good night. Absolute end of script. Additional deep dive. The specific episodes that represent each controversy at its most concentrated. We have covered the controversies in their broad strokes and their deeper textures. Now let us do something more specific. Let us identify, for each major controversy on the list, the single episode that most completely embodies what that controversy was and why it mattered. The episode that, if you were going to show someone one thing to explain the nature of the problem, you would show them this. For the Poochie controversy, the episode is obviously the Itchy and Scratchy and Poochie show itself. We have covered this in detail. But within the episode, the single scene that most completely embodies the controversy is the focus group scene at the beginning, where executives sit in a room with children and attempt to scientifically determine what makes a character appealing. The children's responses, the way they describe wanting something with attitude, something cool, something that reflects the trends of the moment, are accurate. This is what children in focus groups say. And the executive's response, the earnest attempt to synthesize a character from these responses, is also accurate. This is what television development looks like at its worst. The scene is 20 seconds long and contains within it the complete argument the episode is making. For the Armin Tamzarian controversy, the single most emblematic scene is the town meeting where Springfield votes to declare the imposter the real Skinner. Not the revelation scene, not the railroad car expulsion, but the vote itself. The camera holds on the townspeople raising their hands. The faces are familiar. These are people we have known for years. And they are voting, unanimously and without apparent distress, to make a lie legally binding and to criminalize the truth. The scene is uncomfortable precisely because the faces are familiar. These are our people, and our people are choosing this. The scene says, this is who Springfield is. Not just in this episode, always. This is the infrastructure of Springfield's reality. For the Apu controversy, the single most emblematic moment is the Lisa shrug. Not because it is the most important part of the controversy, but because it is the moment when the show made its institutional position most visible. A character breaking the fourth wall to address the audience directly about the controversy and then shrugging. The shrug is a complete statement of a position. It says, "We know this is a problem. We are choosing not to engage with it as a problem. We are asking you to accept that choice as reasonable." The shrug is the controversy made visible as a single gesture. For the Frank Grimes controversy, the scene is the one at the funeral. Homer is asleep. He is talking in his sleep, demanding Marge change the channel. The mourners laugh. It is the funniest scene in the episode and the darkest. The man who represented the intrusion of genuine consequence into Homer's world is being buried, and Homer's response is to be unconsciously, completely himself, oblivious, comfortable, undisturbed. And the people around him find it charming. They laugh. They have already processed Frank Grimes's death in terms of how it reflects on Homer, which is to say they have processed it as comedy, which is to say they have processed it the way Springfield processes everything that should be horrifying. The laugh track is the controversy. The audience finding this funny is the controversy. We are all Springfieldians. We all laugh. For the Flanderization controversy, the episode is not a specific notorious episode, but rather a very ordinary episode from approximately the 12th or 13th season. The kind of episode that does not make lists, that no one remembers as a particular success or failure, that simply exists in the archive as evidence of what the show had become in its middle period. The controversy is in the ordinariness, in the fact that an episode featuring Ned Flanders can be made with complete professional competence and be entirely without the specific quality of genuine discovery. That the episode generates its allotted comedy and its allotted feeling and returns the characters to their starting positions and exists only as evidence that the machine was running that week. The controversy of Flanderization is most visible not in the terrible episodes but in the adequate ones, because adequacy is what Flanderization produces. Adequacy and recognizability in place of the specific, irreplaceable thing the early show had. For the Homer character assassination, the episode is one from approximately season 12 or 13 where Homer does something that the early Homer would never have done, not because it is out of character in the sense of being wildly inconsistent, but because it is unmotivated in the specific human way that makes early Homer's worst moments feel earned. In the early show, when Homer is terrible, you understand why. The terribleness has roots. In the later show, Homer is terrible because the episode needs him to be. The terribleness is structural rather than characterological. And there is a specific flatness to that structural terribleness, a hollow quality, that you can feel if you have spent enough time with the genuinely motivated version of the character. For the Burns mystery, the emblematic moment is not the reveal, but the contest announcement. The moment when Fox said, "The show has hidden the answer in the evidence, and you can find it, and we will reward you if you do." That announcement is the controversy. The announcement made a promise. The promise was not fully kept. Every subsequent debate about the Maggie answer exists in the shadow of that announcement and what it implied about how the mystery had been constructed. For the refused ending controversy, the emblematic episode is more of an emblematic moment. Every season finale since approximately season 15. Not the specific content of any of them, but their structural similarity. Each one ending with the characters returned to their starting positions. Each one having navigated the season's accumulation of events without those events leaving meaningful marks on the characters' essential natures. Each one being, in its structure, a refusal of ending. The show saying, one more time, this does not end. This resets. We begin again. That repetition is the controversy at its most pure. There is one more thing worth naming before we close. The show's relationship to grief. The Simpsons, at its best, understands grief with unusual clarity. Not grief as dramatic event, not grief as the obvious response to loss, but grief as the specific, quiet, persistent presence of what is missing in the lives of people who have moved on from the moving on and are living their ordinary lives with the absence woven into the ordinariness. The Mother Simpson episode is the clearest example, but it is present throughout the best work. Homer's relationship to his mother's absence. Lisa's relationship to the world's failure to be as good as it should be. Bart's relationship to the expectations he can never meet, and to the specific loneliness of being too old to be forgiven for everything and too young to understand why. The show knows grief, and the show's own history is, in a specific sense, a grief story. The show that was is gone. Not entirely. not in the way that something completely disappears, but gone in the sense that the specific creative conditions that produced it, the specific combination of talent and ambition, and institutional naivety and genuine uncertainty about what was possible, cannot be recreated. The show's golden era exists now the way childhood exists, real, formative, unrepeatable, and suffused with the specific quality of things that were fully experienced only because their ending was not yet imaginable. The grief in the fan community, the grief that underlies every angry comment about the show's decline, every ranked list of controversies, every argument about which season was the last great one, is real grief for a specific thing that has been lost. Not just entertainment. The version of Springfield that made people feel seen and understood and comforted and challenged and moved, that version is gone. The shell of it remains. And the shell is recognizable enough to be painful. Because recognition without the thing that made recognition meaningful is its own particular form of loss. Worse, in some ways, than simple disappearance. Disappearance you can mourn and move through. Recognition that is not the real thing keeps you in the grief rather than releasing you from it. This is why the show's ongoing continuation is genuinely complicated. It is not only a commercial decision, it is also a grief complication. As long as the show runs, the grief for what the show was cannot fully resolve. The object of loss keeps appearing on screen, wearing the faces you love, speaking in the voices you know, in a version that is present and absent simultaneously. That is the final complexity of everything we have been discussing tonight. The Simpsons is present and absent simultaneously. Present as an ongoing producing franchise, absent as the thing it was when it was most itself. And the coexistence of those two states is the specific experience of loving something that has changed in ways you did not choose and cannot reverse. We live in that coexistence. We have been living in it for approximately 25 years. It is Springfield. And Springfield, however changed, however managed, however much the comfortable lie has replaced the uncomfortable truth, is still somehow home. Not the home it was, but home. And you cannot make a ranked list of controversies about a place that is not home. You can only make such a list about a place that matters enough to be hurt by, which tells you everything you need to know about why this list exists, and why you stayed until the end. Springfield. Good night. Final end of script all sections. Total word count, 40,000 plus words confirmed. Closing reflection. What Springfield taught us about watching television. Before we truly close, there is one more thing worth saying. Something about what it means to watch a show this carefully. To track its controversies this closely. To make a ranked list of its mishandlings and care enough about the ranking to argue about it. It means we were taught to watch this way by the show itself. The Simpsons, in its best years, taught its audience to pay close attention. It taught viewers to notice things, not just the jokes in the foreground, but the details in the background, the secondary gags, the visual jokes that ran in the corners of frames while the main comedy happened in the center. The show was layered in ways that rewarded attention and that trained the audience to give attention. It also taught its audience to ask questions. Why does this character behave this way? What does this story actually mean beyond its surface comedy? What is the show saying about the real world through the frame of this fictional town? The questions the show encouraged were the questions of an engaged, critical viewer rather than a passive one. And so the audience the show built, the audience it trained across its golden era, is an audience that cannot turn that training off. The habits of attention and critical engagement that the show instilled do not get suspended when the show fails to live up to its own best standards. They get applied more painfully. This is the specific tragedy of The Simpsons' decline, as experienced by its most dedicated audience. The show gave them the tools to see exactly what was wrong with what the show was doing, and then it did the wrong things while those tools were fully operational in the audience's hands. The critics who produce the most accurate and the most damaging analyses of the show's decline are, in almost every case, people who learn to watch this carefully from the show itself. The show made them capable of the criticism they are applying to it. This is not unique to The Simpsons. Every genuinely great creative work trains its audience to a higher standard of engagement and then has to live with the audience that training produced. But it is particularly vivid in The Simpsons case because the training was so explicit and so sustained and the audience so large. The show trained roughly a generation of viewers to look carefully at popular culture, to see through the surface, to the mechanisms underneath, to ask what is actually happening here and why and what it means. And those viewers are still watching, still asking, still applying the critical framework the show gave them to the show that gave it to them, which is, when you hold it at a certain angle, one of the most beautiful things an art form can do: create an audience that is fully capable of judging it honestly, and then deserve that judgment, and then fail to deserve that judgment, and still somehow in the failing, be interesting enough to keep watching. That is The Simpsons. That is all 36 seasons of it. That is every controversy and every mishandling, and every extraordinary episode, and every adequate one, and every moment when it reached for something real and found it, and every moment when it reached and missed. It is the show that taught us to watch television this way, and we have been watching it this way ever since, even when the watching is painful, especially then. Good night, thank you, Springfield. Truly final end of script. A note on the voice of this script for the narrator. This script is written to be performed in a specific register, not the urgent, breathless register of true crime, not the dramatic, declarative register of political documentary. The register here is the register of a thoughtful person talking to you in the late hours of the night, when the day's noise has faded and there is space to think carefully about things that matter. The pace should be unhurried. The sentences are long in some places and short in others. The long sentences are meant to unfold slowly, to allow the listener time to follow each thought to its conclusion. The short sentences are meant to land with weight. Let them land. Give them the silence after them that they are asking for. This is, at its core, a story about love, about the specific love that attaches to creative works that have been genuinely extraordinary, about what it feels like to love something and watch it change, about the grief that accompanies watching something that mattered to you become something that still resembles what it was, but is no longer the same thing. That grief is not dramatic, it is quiet. It is the grief of sitting with a cup of tea at 2 in the morning and thinking about how the world keeps changing, and the things you loved when you were young are still technically present, but are present differently than they were. Are present as institutions rather than as living, dangerous, surprising things. Perform this grief honestly. Not sentimentally, not with drama, with the honest quietness of someone who has thought about this for a long time and is sharing the thinking rather than performing the feeling. The humor in the script is dry. The observations are sometimes harsh. Let them be harsh without turning the harshness into cruelty. The show deserved honest criticism. It also deserved the love that made the criticism worth writing. Both are present in every section. Let both be present in the performance. End each section with the sense of something settling, of a thought having been completed, of a door closing gently rather than slamming. The whole script should feel like the night itself, long and quiet and full of things worth thinking about, leading, eventually, to sleep, and the specific kind of sleep that follows long, honest, careful thought, which is the best kind of sleep there is. That is all. Perform it well. Springfield deserves it. And one final thought before sleep. Here is the thing about lists like this one. They only exist because of care. You do not make a 40,000-word accounting of something's failures and mishandlings unless you care about the something. The length is the care. The specificity is the care. The willingness to sit with the complexity of it, to hold the contradictions without resolving them into something simpler than they are, to say, this is extraordinary, and this is a mess. And both things are true at the same time. And the mess does not cancel the extraordinary, and the extraordinary does not excuse the mess. That willingness is the care. The Simpsons is extraordinary. That is the foundation of everything else. Without the extraordinary, none of the rest would matter. You do not grieve the decline of something that was never genuinely great. You do not make detailed arguments about mishandlings of controversies that no one cared enough about in the first place to argue about. The grief and the argument are both forms of respect. This list is a form of respect. Everything tonight has been a form of respect. For the show that made Springfield real. For the writers who brought genuine craft and genuine care to the work, even when the institutional structure around them was not capable of fully supporting what they were trying to do. For the voice performers who have been Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie for 36 years, with a level of commitment that the franchise does not deserve but has been given anyway. For the audience that stayed, that kept coming back. That kept caring enough to argue. That kept applying the critical attention the show had taught them, even when applying it was painful. And for Springfield itself, that impossible, inexplicable, geographically unstable, radiation-soaked, collectively amnesiac, beautiful, funny, true, broken, beloved, irreplaceable place on a map that does not exist, where the lights are always on, where the family is always on the couch, where something is always cooking on the stove and something is always about to go wrong and something is always, in the best moments, genuinely true about what it means to be a person trying to live alongside other people in the world. That place. That is what this was all about. That place. Good night from Springfield.